There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be. Whatever the day has asked of you, it can wait until morning. The night is yours. Settle back, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to be carried gently into another time. Not so very far away as medieval castles or ancient kingdoms, but far enough. A little more than 100 years. Into the age of coal smoke and cobblestones, of gas lamps flickering in November fog, of narrow streets in great industrial cities, and the quiet lives of people whose names we have mostly forgotten. Somewhere deep in the 19th century, in a city thick with the smell of coal smoke and damp stone and the faintly chemical air that drifts from 100 different workshops and factories and yards, a small wooden box sits upon a kitchen shelf. It is an ordinary thing, scratched at the corners perhaps, bearing the faded illustration of a lion or a crown, or a cheerful red sun half risen over letters spelling out a brand name in confident Victorian typography. Inside it, arranged in neat rows like tiny soldiers standing at attention, are the matches, white-tipped, quiet, patient, each one a sliver of soft wood, a fraction of a second of potential fire waiting in the darkness of the box. You have probably never thought much about a match. You strike it, it lights, the moment passes. The flame catches a candle, a stove, a lamp. The match curls into black and is dropped and forgotten. It has done its one small job, and it is done. But behind that small flame is a story far older and far darker than you might imagine. A story of factories hidden in industrial fog, of men and women and children who worked in rooms lit by the glow of phosphorus, of a disease so strange that the afflicted could be seen glowing in the dark as they walked home at night through the narrow streets of East London or Lyon or Vienna or Chicago. A story of a harm that was known, documented, scientifically described, and allowed to continue for 60 years because the people being harmed were not the people making the decisions. This is their story. Come into it gently. There is no rush. The night is long, and the story will carry you slowly like a lantern moving ahead of you through an old house, room by room, lighting what needs to be seen. We will move through this history as a sleeper moves through a landscape that is both familiar and strange, recognizing certain shapes and certain rhythms, finding unexpected depths in ordinary objects. This is what all good history does. It finds the depth in the ordinary, finds the weight and the complexity and the human cost in things that might otherwise be simply present without being seen. The story we will follow tonight begins in the laboratories and workshops of the early 19th century and ends in the archives of the 20th. It travels through the industrial cities of England and France and Germany and Austria and America, through the halls of parliaments and the offices of factory inspectors and the wards of charity hospitals. It moves through the very specific physical environment of the match factory, with its particular smells and textures and the quality of its light at different hours of the day. It passes through the private experience of individual workers who are documented enough to give us glimpses of their specific lives, and it arrives at a place that is, in some important sense, here, the matchbox, the everyday object, the small container of fire that sits in a kitchen drawer or on a shelf and does its work and is replaced when empty with another box just like it, bearing no mark of the long argument about whether it should be safe. The candle beside you, if you have one, was lit by something. Let the darkness receive you now and let the story begin. There are stories that move quickly and stories that move slowly, and the difference between them is not always a question of what kind of story deserves to be told quickly and what kind slowly. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that need to be told at the pace of ordinary life, which is a slow pace. The pace of one day following another, of seasons changing inside a life that is mostly composed of routine and repetition, with the significant events scattered among the ordinary ones like stones in a field, visible but not crowded. This is one of those stories. The pace it asks of you is the pace of the night, which is unhurried and patient and does not press toward an ending. Let the warmth of wherever you are settle around you. Let the sounds outside, whatever they are, become part of the background rather than the foreground, the street sounds or the quiet sounds of a house at night or the faint presence of wind against the window. Let your breathing find its slower night rhythm. The 19th century is not so far away as it sometimes feels. The great-great-grandparents of people living today worked in the industrial cities of that century. The streets those people walked still exist in the maps of those cities, even where the buildings have changed and the specific textures of the gas lamp era have been replaced by electric light and concrete. The lives lived in those streets were real lives, with the full weight and complexity of any life, and the story we're moving into tonight is the story of some of those lives and of the specific circumstances that shaped them in ways they could not control and did not choose. The candle beside you, if you have one, was lit by something. Let the darkness receive you now and let the story begin. If you enjoy listening to sleepy history stories like this one, please subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. To understand the match, you must first understand the darkness that preceded it. Imagine waking before sunrise in the year 1820. Not the gentle darkness of a modern bedroom with blackout curtains and the faint reassuring glow of electronic standby lights on a dozen small devices. True darkness. The kind that pressed against the windows like a living presence. The kind in which you could hold your hand before your face at arm's length and see nothing at all. The kind of darkness that made the world feel genuinely different at 4 a.m. than it did at noon. That made the simple act of moving through a house at night an exercise in memory and touch, in the slow mapping of familiar furniture in unfamiliar dimness. In the early 19th century, the getting of fire was still a ritual, an intimate daily ceremony that had changed very little in its essential nature since the Middle Ages. A careful household kept its coals alive through the night if it could, banking them beneath a deep bed of ash before the family went to sleep, coaxing them back to orange life in the morning with careful breath blown gently from cupped hands, and dried bark, and patience. If the coals were alive, the morning started. The kettle went on. The bread went near the heat. Life continued in its ordinary forward motion. If the coals died entirely in the night, which happened in cold weather, or when the coal was running low, a child might be sent to a neighbour's hearth to carry back a burning brand, cupped in trembling, careful hands against the morning wind, walking quickly through the cold, dark street with the small, precarious flame. This was not an unusual errand. It was simply a fact of daily life, woven into the rhythms of the household as naturally as drawing water from the well or feeding the animals. Everyone understood that fire was a communal resource, and that its movement between households was part of the network of small practical dependencies that held a community together. And if no neighbour could be reached, or if the morning was particularly cold and the wind particularly sharp and unforgiving, or if the family lived in one of the new urban tenements where the neighbours were strangers rather than kin, there was the tinder box. The tinder box was perhaps the most important small object in any household of the early modern period, and yet it was such an ordinary thing that it barely registers in the historical imagination. It was a metal box, usually of iron or tin, worn smooth with years of handling, often kept beside the bed or near the hearth within easy reach in the dark. Inside it lived 3 essential elements, each depending on the other 2. The flint, a piece of hard, pale grey or dark stone that could be struck at the right angle against steel to produce a shower of hot sparks. The steel, a curved bar against which the flint was struck in a quick, practiced downward motion, the technique learned in childhood and repeated thousands of times until it was as natural as breathing. And the tinder, a nest of dried material at the bottom of the box, usually charred cloth or scorched linen that had been carefully prepared in advance by burning it briefly and then smothering it before it consumed itself entirely, producing a blackened fabric that would catch those sparks and hold them as a spreading glow rather than letting them die. From the tinder, the glow was transferred with great care to a sulphur-tipped splint of wood called a match splint, whose sulphur head would catch from the ember and burn with a brief yellow flame sufficient to light a candle or carry to the hearth. The whole process, when described in this way, sounds like a series of small, orderly steps leading to a certain outcome. In practice, on a cold morning with stiff fingers and an uncooperative draught from the ill-fitting window, it was a negotiation. The sparks would fly at the wrong angle and miss the tinder entirely, falling harmlessly onto the floor. The tinder would catch but hold its glow too briefly, fading before the sulphur splint could be brought to it. The splint would be damp or would crumble in frozen fingers. A draught from the window would intervene at precisely the wrong moment, and the whole small ceremony would collapse and have to begin again. 10 minutes to start a fire, sometimes considerably longer, sometimes an entire morning's frustration compressed into the distance between a cold hearth and a lit one. There is something almost meditative in this picture, If you let yourself settle into it and stop thinking about it as inconvenience and start thinking about it simply as life, the bent figure in the half-darkness of a December morning, the practiced arc of steel against flint, the small bright cascade of sparks falling like a handful of tiny stars into the nest of charred linen, the breath of concentration held still, the first faint spread of orange glow in the tinder, the careful, unhurried transfer of that glow to the sulphur splint, the brief, sweet moment of successful flame. People who lived this way did not find it particularly remarkable. It was what mornings were. It was what warmth and light required. The ritual was old enough that no one remembered it being otherwise, and the knowledge of how to perform it was handed from generation to generation as quietly and thoroughly as the knowledge of how to bake bread or repair a harness. A child who had watched her mother tend the tinderbox 1,000 times could, by the age of 8 or 9, manage the whole operation herself on a calm morning. On a difficult morning, even a practiced adult might spend 20 minutes coaxing fire from reluctant materials while the cold deepened and the household waited. The tinderbox had its own culture, its own set of practices and accumulated wisdom. There were best types of tinder, which dried more evenly, held the ember more reliably, could be trusted in the damp of autumn or the freeze of January. There were best techniques for striking, angles and forces that experienced hands knew by feel. There were seasonal adjustments because the tinder that worked in July rarely worked as well in November, and a careful household understood and adapted for this. The knowledge was embedded in the domestic practice of every family in every part of Europe and North America, taken for granted in the way that all embedded knowledge is taken for granted, unremarked, invisible in its presence, conspicuous only in its absence. In rural England, in the villages and small market towns that still housed the majority of the population, as late as 1830, the tinderbox had the character of inherited household treasure. Families kept the same box for generations, the metal worn smooth by decades of mourning hands, the flint replaced when necessary from stones found in the fields or purchased from the ironmonger, the tinder restocked with careful attention to the correct preparation. Children learned to use the tinderbox as they learned everything else essential to domestic management, by watching and then by doing under supervision, and then by doing alone, the knowledge passing from one generation to the next as reliably as the box itself. In the cities, the tinderbox was a more precarious object. The density of urban living meant that fire moved differently through the social landscape. The great fires that had destroyed portions of London and other cities within living memory made the urban population attentive to fire in a way that had no equivalent in the villages, where the distances between buildings were greater and the risks of conflagration less catastrophic. The tinderbox was used differently in the city, with a different awareness of the small space between a controlled flame and an uncontrolled one. All of this was the context into which the phosphorus match arrived, and it is important to understand the context to understand the reception. The match did not arrive as a novelty curiosity, something to be admired and set aside. It arrived as a solution to a genuine problem that affected everyone, every morning, in ways that range from mildly inconvenient to seriously consequential. The speed of its adoption was not the speed of fashion, but the speed of genuine utility, recognized immediately and acted on. But the industrial age was remaking the world on a scale and at a pace that had no precedent in human history, and one of the many things it was remaking was the relationship between time and production. The industrial city was, among other things, a laboratory for new forms of social organization. The village had organized social life around the rhythms of agriculture and the constraints of geography, with relatively stable communities whose members knew each other across multiple generations, and whose daily routines were shaped by the seasons and the weather and the requirements of the land. The industrial city organized social life around the rhythms of the factory clock and the requirements of production, with large and often transient populations whose members might be entirely unknown to each other despite living in close proximity, whose daily routines were shaped by the whistle and the wage packet and the need to be at the gate before the bell. This reorganization of daily life had consequences that the early industrial cities were only beginning to understand in the 1830s and 40s. The density of urban living that industrial production required created new public health problems that the sanitary infrastructure of the cities was not designed to manage. Cholera, typhus, tuberculosis, The diseases of overcrowding and inadequate water supply and primitive sewage systems killed in the industrial cities in numbers that had no equivalent in the rural communities from which the city populations had come. The match factory workers who developed phossy jaw were not the only workers in the Victorian industrial city being harmed by the conditions of their employment. They were one group among many, and their specific harm was distinguished from the general harm of industrial poverty primarily by its specific chemical cause and its specific preventability. But the industrial age was remaking the world on a scale and at a pace that had no precedent in human history, and one of the many things it was remaking was the relationship between time and production. In the mills and factories of early industrial England, time was money in a way that was not metaphorical but brutally literal. Workers were paid by the piece or by the hour, and both arrangements meant that time spent not producing was money not made. The margins of the working day were compressed to nothing. There was no softness in them, and the long patient ritual of the tinderbox was increasingly incompatible with the rhythms that industrial production demanded. The great industrial cities that were forming across the north and Midlands of England, and in their counterparts in France and the German states and the American northeast, were places of a density and a pace that had no equivalent in the agricultural world from which their populations had largely come. In a village, fire moved between households at the pace of a morning walk. In a city of 200,000 people, crowded into tenements and lodging houses and back-to-back terraces, the fire-sharing network of the village was simply not available in the same way. The strangers who lived above you and beside you and below you were not kin. The morning errand for a burning brand required a relationship of sufficient trust to knock on a stranger's door before 6 in the morning, and such trust took time to build and was not universally available. And across the cities of Europe, the demand for reliable, rapid fire starting grew alongside the demand for everything else the industrial age was producing. Candles needed lighting by the dozen in great manufactories, and counting houses where work went on into the evening. Furnaces needed stoking quickly and reliably at the start of each working day. Pipes needed drawing for the men who worked in the cold and wet of construction, and quarrying and river work. Stoves needed starting before the day's cooking could begin. The home, the workshop, the inn, the tavern, the kitchen, the factory floor, the apothecary, the school, the church hall, all of them hungry for flame at a moment's notice, all of them still dependent on a technology that had not fundamentally changed in centuries. Into this hunger came the inventors, the experimenters. The culture of invention in the early 19th century was, by any measure, one of the most productive in human history. And it was productive in part because the relationship between scientific curiosity and commercial opportunity had never been so clear or so immediate. The Industrial Revolution had demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that understanding the physical world could be translated into machines and processes and products that changed how people lived and how goods were made, and how quickly and cheaply the necessities and luxuries of life could be produced and distributed. The lesson had been absorbed by a generation of educated men who combined scientific training with commercial ambition, in proportions that varied from person to person, but that, in the aggregate, produced a remarkable surge of invention across almost every domain of material life. Chemistry was a particularly fertile domain in this period, partly because it was the science most directly applicable to the transformation of materials, which is what most industrial processes fundamentally are. The chemical understanding of combustion, of oxidation, of the behavior of specific substances at specific temperatures under specific conditions, was advancing rapidly through the first decades of the 19th century, and the practitioners of this young science were acutely aware that their knowledge had practical applications that had not yet been fully exploited. Into this hunger came the inventors, the experimenters, the restless chemists who peopled the universities and private laboratories of the early 19th century, who were in many cases young men of good education and keen minds, who understood perfectly well that the industrial age was creating new markets for new technologies, and who were not too proud to notice that something as unglamorous and domestic as a reliable method of starting fire might represent a significant commercial opportunity. The story of the modern match begins, as many stories do, with a curious accident and a long preoccupation with phosphorus. Phosphorus, the word itself drawn from ancient Greek meaning light-bearer. It was first isolated in the 17th century by a Hamburg alchemist named Hennig Brand, working in the tradition of alchemical experiment that was still, in 1669, the closest thing the world had to systematic chemistry. Brand was attempting, in the peculiar fashion of the era, to distill gold from human urine, operating on the theory that the golden colour of urine must indicate some golden essence within it. He processed enormous quantities of the substance over a period of months, heating and condensing and filtering and heating again with the patient obsessiveness that alchemical work demanded. He did not find gold. What he found instead, in the waxy residue of his heating and boiling and condensing, was a substance unlike anything he had seen before. It was white, slightly waxy in texture, and it glowed with a pale, cold, eerily beautiful light in the darkness of his laboratory. When exposed to air for long enough, or when the temperature rose slightly, it burst into spontaneous flame. Brand called it cold fire. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him, both thrilled and deeply unsettled by what he had found. Others who encountered it over the following years called it the devil's element, a name that captured something of the quality that made it so striking. The combination of beauty and danger, the light that came without heat, the fire that needed no striking. For a generation it circulated among the natural philosophers of Europe as a curiosity, something to be shown in darkened rooms to audiences who gasped appropriately and went home with the image of it lingering in their minds like a dream they could not quite shake. It was expensive to produce, difficult to store safely, and its spontaneous inflammability made it a hazard that could not easily be managed. The great natural philosophers of the late 17th century, Robert Boyle among them, examined and documented its properties with the careful attention that genuinely novel phenomena attracted, filling their notebooks with observations of the cold light and the spontaneous ignition and the peculiar smell and the behaviour of the substance in water versus air. It was fascinating and it was dangerous and it was not yet useful. But the chemists kept working. The century turned. And slowly, through the long accumulation of experiment that the 18th and early 19th centuries produced, the possibilities of phosphorus began to resolve themselves into something practical. The first recognisably modern matches emerged in the 1820s, a decade remarkable for its energy and optimism in the scientific and technical fields. In 1826, a British chemist named John Walker made the discovery that would eventually reshape the daily lives of millions of people, though he could not have known this at the time. Walker was a quiet, methodical man working in his shop and laboratory in Stockton-on-Tees, combining and testing chemical compounds with the patient curiosity of someone who was interested in the properties of things, rather than in the prospect of growing wealthy from them. He found that a mixture of antimony sulfide, potassium chlorate, and various binding agents, applied to the end of a small wooden splint and allowed to dry, would ignite when the splint was drawn rapidly across a rough surface. Walker called these congreves, after the military rockets that had recently distinguished themselves in action, a name that suggests something of the excitement that attended the invention of anything resembling controlled explosion in the post-Napoleonic period. He sold them from his shop in small cardboard boxes, each box containing 50 splints, and a folded piece of sandpaper for striking. They were not cheap. They were not always reliable. They tended to throw sparks in unpredictable directions and produced a strong smell of sulphur when they burned. But they were unmistakably matches, and the principle was sound. The principle spread with the velocity that only a genuinely useful idea can achieve. By the mid-1830s, Walker's basic idea had been taken up by manufacturers in several countries, and had already evolved in the hands of different experimenters into a range of competing formulations and designs. The friction match, in its various forms, was becoming a commercial reality. What it had not yet become was a reliable, affordable, universal commodity. The early matches were expensive relative to the wages of ordinary working people, requiring the purchase of a whole box when only a few might be needed in a week, and the boxes varied considerably in quality from one manufacturer to another, some performing reliably and others producing disappointment in proportion to their cost. The market was therefore still evolving. The tinderbox still shared the kitchen shelf with the new matches in many households. The fire-sharing custom still persisted in communities where neighbours were close enough and trusting enough to knock on each other's doors on a cold morning for a piece of burning brand. The old technology and the new coexisted in the peculiarly Victorian way of things transitioning, with one foot in the old world and one in the new, neither fully replaced nor fully replaced. What changed this transitional state was the phosphorus match, which was not merely better than what came before, but categorically different in a way that ended the coexistence. The phosphorus match worked in conditions where other matches failed. It worked in cold, it worked in damp, it worked for anyone who could manage the single gesture of striking it, which was essentially everyone. It was cheap enough, once the manufacturing process was established at scale, to be genuinely affordable for the working population in a way that earlier matches had not quite managed. And it was consistent in a way that industrial manufacture could guarantee, in a way that craft production could not. Within a generation of the phosphorus match's widespread introduction in the 1830s and 1840s, the tinderbox was functionally obsolete in the urban households of Europe and North America. It persisted in rural areas, where the match was still an expense that might be weighed against the available alternative. It persisted among the very poor, for whom even the small cost of a box of matches was not always available. But for the broad middle mass of the industrial population, the tinderbox had been replaced by something that worked better and cost less effort, and was, in the simple everyday experience of using it, simply more satisfactory. The principle spread with the velocity that only a genuinely useful idea can achieve. Within a few years, inventors and manufacturers across Britain, France, Germany, and the Austrian Empire were working on variations, improvements, and refinements. Some matches used different chemical combinations and burned more cleanly. Others used different woods or different shapes of splint. The market was expanding in every direction simultaneously because the demand was everywhere and the profit was real, and the technology was not so complex that a reasonably well-equipped chemical establishment could not engage with it. The atmosphere of the cities where the match trade grew was, by the 1830s and 40s, an atmosphere already profoundly changed by industry. The coal smoke that was the essential byproduct of the steam engine and the household hearth and the industrial furnace had by this period given many of the great industrial cities of England a characteristic quality of air that was unlike anything their populations had experienced in the previous centuries of largely wood-heated, wind-ventilated existence. The smoke was not merely unpleasant, it was visually transformative. Visitors to Manchester and Birmingham and the East End of London in the 1830s and 40s wrote with a kind of horrified fascination about the quality of light in these cities, the way the midday sun could appear dimmed and yellowish through layers of coal smoke, the way the buildings darkened from their original brick or stone to a uniform sooty grey within a few years of construction, the way the fog that developed in cold, damp weather combined with the smoke to produce the particular atmospheric phenomenon that later generations would call smog, a physical object rather than simply a weather condition. In this atmosphere, already saturated with the byproducts of industry, the match factory added its particular chemical note. The phosphorus vapour from the dipping rooms was not the most significant atmospheric contribution of the Victorian industrial city. It was one thread among many in a complex and unhealthy atmospheric environment, but it was specific, and its specificity was eventually what made it tractable. You could demonstrate that this particular vapour caused this particular disease in this particular population of workers. The general unhealthiness of the Victorian industrial city was a harder problem, but this specific piece of it could be identified and addressed. And then came white phosphorus. In 1830, the French chemist Charles Sauria, working at the École Polytechnique in the tradition of rigorous systematic French chemical science, developed what he called the phosphoric match. The idea was straightforward, almost audaciously simple in conception. A mixture of white phosphorus combined with sulfur and various binding agents to give the mixture the right consistency and adhesion was applied in a small bead to the head of a wooden splint and allowed to cure. The result was a match that could be struck against virtually any rough surface. But the backstory to Sauria's phosphoric match, the specific intellectual journey by which phosphorus went from Hennig Brand's alchemical accident to the tip of a wooden splint being struck against the kitchen shelf in the 1830s, is itself a story of the particular culture of early 19th century chemistry, a culture in which the boundaries between scientific investigation and commercial application were far more permeable than they would later become. Sauria was 21 years old when he developed the phosphoric match. He was a student, working in the context of the École Polytechnique's tradition of systematic chemical investigation, and the clarity of the idea he arrived at suggests both the quality of the education he had received and the fertility of the specific moment in the history of chemistry in which he was working. The 1820s and 1830s were years of extraordinarily rapid progress in the understanding of chemical reactivity and chemical combination, years in which the theoretical framework that was emerging from the work of Lavoisier and his successors was being applied to practical problems with a directness and a confidence that produced real innovations in rapid succession. The phosphoric match was one of those innovations, but it was also, from the moment of its invention, something more than a scientific achievement. It was immediately a commercial object, a thing that could be manufactured and sold and used by people who had no knowledge of its chemistry and no interest in acquiring such knowledge. The gap between the laboratory and the kitchen shelf was, in this case, remarkably short. Within a year of Sauria's formulation, manufacturers in France and Germany were producing phosphoric matches at commercial scale. Within a decade, the production had spread to England and to other parts of Europe, and had begun to extend beyond the European industrial heartland. The result was a match that could be struck against virtually any rough surface: wood, stone, brick, the sole of a boot, the rough side of a man's coat, and would ignite reliably, quickly, and brightly. It was not sensitive to humidity in the way that some earlier match formulations had been. It worked in cold conditions as well as warm. It was robust enough to survive the knocks and jostling of everyday handling, without the splint heads crumbling or the chemical coating flaking off. And once the manufacturing process was established, it could be made cheaply enough to be genuinely affordable to ordinary households. The phosphorus match was a revelation. It was, in the most literal sense, transformative. For the first time in human history, fire could be summoned in a single moment, by any person, in any conditions, with a single flicking gesture that required no skill and no patience and no particular strength. The tinderbox, with its flint and steel and carefully charred tinder and sulphur splints, was obsolete within a generation. Not immediately, not everywhere, not for those who could not afford even the modest price of a box of matches, but the direction of travel was clear and it did not reverse. The match factories appeared almost immediately, rising in the industrial cities of Europe with the characteristic speed of Victorian commercial enterprise. But before they rose, and alongside the early years of their rising, there was a transitional period in which the match and the tinderbox coexisted in the same households, the new technology present but not yet fully trusted, the old technology maintained as insurance against the new one's failure. The early phosphorus matches were not perfectly reliable. They could break in the dipping if the wood was not correctly dried. They could fail to ignite in humid conditions. They could ignite unexpectedly if the box was carelessly handled or the matches allowed to rub together. The sulphur smell when they burned was, to some users, deeply unpleasant, a sharp, acrid note that lingered in enclosed rooms long after the flame itself was out. These were real drawbacks, noted in the letters and diaries of the period, with the specific detail that people use when describing something they have had to develop opinions about through repeated personal experience. A correspondent in Liverpool writes in the early 1830s that she finds the phosphorus matches useful in the mornings, but cannot recommend them for a tightly enclosed room because the smell is intolerable. A householder in Edinburgh notes in his diary the satisfaction of the first successful match on a winter morning, and the less satisfactory experience of the second box in the same week, which he suspects may have been damaged in transit. The match was already part of daily experience, already generating the kind of small, strong opinions that ordinary objects accumulate when people live with them. The advertising of the early match trade has a particular interest for the historian of material culture. The manufacturers of the 1830s and 1840s were selling not merely a product but a convenience, a transformation of daily experience from difficulty to ease, and their advertising understood this. The images on early matchboxes, the sun rising over a horizon, the lion couchant on a field of flames, the mythological figure of Prometheus bearing fire from the gods, were images of elemental power domesticated into a small cardboard box, available to anyone who could afford a penny or two. They sold not just the matches but the feeling the matches made possible. The morning fire started without effort, the evening lamp lit at first attempt, the small daily ceremony of fire achieved without the long negotiation of the tinderbox. The match factories appeared almost immediately, rising in the industrial cities of Europe with the characteristic speed of Victorian commercial enterprise. In England, factories opened in London and the Midlands and the North. In France, in the cities of the Rhine Valley, in Vienna and Prague and Budapest, in the industrial zones of the German states. Capital flowed toward the industry because the demand was enormous and the margins were attractive, and the technology, at least in its early form, was not excessively capital intensive. A dipping room, some wooden frames, a supply of phosphorus paste, a workforce prepared to work for the wages on offer. That was the minimum required, and the minimum was achievable in a great many places. It was a trade built on light, a trade that brightened the evenings of millions of ordinary households, that made the morning ritual of fire starting a matter of seconds rather than minutes, that gave to ordinary people a convenience that had previously been available in the form of always lit fires and always present servants to tend them only to the wealthy. And it was a trade that was, from its very first years, quietly and invisibly and steadily destroying some of the people who made it. The harm was not apparent at the beginning. It rarely is with such things. The workers in the first match factories were not told they were handling something dangerous, because no one knew yet in the specific sense that knowledge requires before it becomes useful, the sense of knowing that this particular substance, inhaled in this particular way, over this particular duration, produces this particular disease in this proportion of exposed workers. That knowledge would take years to accumulate, and decades more to translate into action. What the workers noticed first was the toothache, a deep persistent ache in the lower jaw, the kind that seemed to begin in the teeth and radiate outward. And toothache, in the 19th century, was so common as to be essentially universal among the working population. There was nothing in a toothache that said phosphorus factory. There was nothing in a toothache that said anything at all, except the ordinary misery of a tooth that needed attention, and the ordinary calculation of whether you could afford the attention it needed. But let us leave that part for a later act, and stay for now in the early years of the match trade, in its particular mixture of ingenuity and innocence and commercial energy, in the factory buildings going up at the ends of narrow streets in East London and along the banks of the Seine and in the crowded districts of Vienna, in the wooden dipping frames being built and the trays of phosphorus paste being prepared and the first batches of matches being laid out to dry on their racks in the lamplight of a new kind of working space. Somewhere in a small house in London or Vienna or a provincial French town, someone draws a match across the rough paper inside its box for the first time. There is a brief, satisfying hiss. A small cone of bright flame appears as if from nowhere, steady and clear and requiring no second attempt. And in the darkness of an early morning kitchen, a candle takes the light and holds it steady, and the room fills with a gentle, warm, entirely ordinary glow. No one is thinking about phosphorus factories. No one is thinking about the workers in the dipping rooms or the vapour they are breathing or what it will eventually do to the bones they carry inside their faces. This is not moral indifference in most cases. It is the ordinary condition of consuming a product without knowledge of the conditions under which it was made, which is the condition of almost everyone who buys almost anything in a commercial economy. The consumer of matches in 1845 does not know what happens in a match factory, any more than most people today know what happens in the facilities that produce the objects they use daily. The knowledge that would make the connection visible has not yet become public knowledge. It is in the medical journals beginning to accumulate, but medical journals do not reach the kitchen shelf on which the matchbox sits, and the physician who reads them in the morning does not, when he strikes a match to light his study lamp in the evening, make the connection between the phosphorus on the match head and the phosphorus in the body of the worker who made it. Connections of this kind between the comfortable end of a consumption chain and the harmful conditions at the productive end of it are not made automatically. They require specific effort, specific communication, and a public willingness to engage with information that is uncomfortable because it implicates the consumer in harm that the consumer would prefer not to think about. The match industry campaign was, in part, a campaign to make this connection visible and to sustain it in public awareness long enough that it could produce the legislative action that visibility alone did not guarantee. But that campaign belongs to a later chapter of this story. For now, the box is on the shelf, the candle is lit, and the morning is beginning in its ordinary way, warm and sufficient and uninflected by any knowledge of the industrial machinery that produced the small miracle of instantaneous fire. No one is thinking about phosphorus factories. No one is thinking about the workers in the dipping rooms or the vapour they are breathing, or what it will eventually do to the bones they carry inside their faces. They are thinking about bread to bake and fires to lay, and the particular texture of a morning that has started well, warmly, successfully. The flame caught on the first attempt for the first time in a life previously spent coaxing fire from reluctant steel and stone. The box is placed back on the shelf. The candle burns steadily on the table. Outside, the street is beginning to lighten with the first grey promises of morning. And the world that is being slowly, quietly, irreversibly remade by this small object is not yet aware of the price being paid in the rooms where it is made. There were, even in the earliest years of the match trade, people who noticed things. A factory physician in Vienna, examining workers from a nearby match manufactory in the mid-1830s, observed a pattern of jaw complaints among the dipping room workers that struck him as unusual in its concentration and its specific location. A factory inspector in England, visiting one of the new matchworks in the East End in the early 1840s, noted in his report that the air in the upper rooms smelled of something he could not easily name, and that a number of the workers appeared to have swelling around the face and neck. These observations were made and noted and filed and did not, in the 1830s and 1840s, produce any action at all. The apparatus for translating such observations into changed practice did not yet exist in any useful form. The matchmakers themselves had varied awareness of the risks they were creating. In some cases, factory owners and managers clearly had some knowledge of the jaw disease by the 1840s or 1850s, because the disease was already present among their workers, and the older workers already had names for it. In other cases, the management genuinely did not know in any specific sense what was happening to the workers in the dipping rooms, or if they suspected something, had not looked closely enough to form a clear picture. The Victorian industrial workplace was not a place of transparency, and the relationship between what management knew and what workers knew was structured by the enormous difference in power between them. But the match was already everywhere. It was in the homes of the working class, where the convenience it offered was real and immediate and not to be set aside because of dangers that no one had yet explained to the consumers who struck them every morning. It was in the workshops and the kitchens and the taverns and the counting houses and the churches and the schools. The annual production of phosphorus matches in England alone had reached tens of millions of boxes by the mid-1840s, and the industry was growing rather than plateauing. The product had found its market. The market had become dependent on the product, and the rooms where the product was made continued to fill each morning with the workers who breathed the vapour and went home in the evening with the faint phosphorus glow on their skin, washing it off before bed, waking the next morning to do it again. The factory stands at the end of a narrow street in the East End of London in the year 1860. It is 3 stories of dark brick, its windows small and close set, its walls already stained below the eaves by years of industrial soot and November rain. A thin plume of whitish smoke rises from a ventilation pipe near the roof, though, on still days, with no wind off the river, it merely rises to the level of the 3rd-storey windowsills and hangs there, barely moving, gradually dispersing into the general grey of the London air. The street outside is a working street. There is a rag-and-bone yard on the corner that smells of damp leather and old metal on damp days, which is most days. A chandler's shop whose windows are permanently clouded with tallow deposits on the inside. A narrow public house with a painted sign so faded by weather that it is impossible to determine what it was originally meant to depict. Early in the morning, before 6, when the night soil cart comes through, the smell in the street is sharp enough to wake anyone still sleeping with a window cracked. Later in the day, when the sun comes round to warm the cobblestones and the east wind drops, the smell is merely unpleasant rather than actively assaulting. The neighbourhood surrounding the factory is the neighbourhood of Victorian industrial poverty at its most ordinary. The factory is a landmark in this neighbourhood in the way that certain buildings become landmarks not because of any particular architectural distinction, but because of their continuous defining presence. It has been here long enough that the people who grew up on these streets cannot remember a time when it was not here. The smell of the match trade, the specific chemical note that drifts from the ventilation pipes on still days, and that the neighbourhood's residents have long since ceased to consciously register, is as much a part of the place as the smell of the river or the smell of the chandler's shop. It is simply what this part of the city smells like. The factory's relationship to the neighbourhood is complex in the way that the relationship between a major employer and its immediate community is always complex. It is the reason many of these families live on this particular street, rather than some other street in some other part of the city. The wages it pays are part of the economic infrastructure of the neighbourhood, cycling through the shops and the public house, and the rent payments, and the market stalls that supply the daily needs of its workforce. When the factory is busy, the neighbourhood is slightly more prosperous. When it's slow, the neighbourhood is correspondingly tighter. And the factory is the reason some of the people who live on this street are sick in ways they might not otherwise be sick. This is also part of the factory's relationship to its neighbourhood, the part that is not acknowledged in the transactions between the gate and the wage packet and the shop counter, but that is present in the particular quality of attention the older women pay to the faces of the younger ones, and in the specific way the word jaw is sometimes used in conversations that stop when a stranger comes close enough to hear. The neighbourhood surrounding the factory is the neighbourhood of Victorian industrial poverty at its most ordinary. Not the desperate extremity that the social investigators of the period sometimes documented for middle-class readers who needed the extremity made vivid to pay attention, but the ordinary, unremarkable daily poverty of families living on wages that covered necessities with nothing left for contingency, who managed their margins with the particular practical intelligence that poverty requires. The houses are terraced, 2 or 3 rooms each, shared in many cases between 2 families. The yards behind them are shared, the privies shared, the water supply shared where it exists at all. The streets are lit by gas lamps on the main thoroughfares and by nothing on the smaller ones. The children who live on this street go to school when the fees are manageable, and when there is no more pressing use for their time and labour. They play in the street in the hours between school and dinner, and the games they play are versions of the games children have always played with whatever's available. Some of them will spend their working lives in the factory at the end of the street, or in factories like it, or in the dock work or the laundry work or the 100 other forms of manual labour that the city requires, and for which it draws from the streets around each factory in the endless economic circulation of the urban poor. The workers arrive before 6. They come singly, and in small groups of 2 or 3, women mostly, though there are men and older boys and a number of girls who by the evidence of their size should perhaps still be in school but are not, because school does not pay 12 shillings a week, and 12 shillings a week is the difference between eating and not eating, for families with multiple mouths and inadequate margins. They come in shawls, most of them, or worn coats that have seen more winters than their stitching really wanted to. They come in boots that are frequently slightly too large or slightly too small, inherited or purchased from market stalls, the small economies of clothing that people make when clothing has to last and cannot be replaced often. They carry their dinners in paper parcels tucked under their arms, or in small baskets, bread and perhaps a scrape of dripping or a fragment of cold potato, dinner planned and portioned at home in the morning dark. They do not talk much at the gate. There is not much to say at 10 minutes to 6 on a November morning in the East End of London. The important conversations, the ones about children and rent and the cost of coal and the landlord's latest communication, were had last night, or will be had later. The morning gate is a quiet place. People gather in it with the particular stillness of those who are conserving themselves for the hours ahead. The foreman opens the gate at 5:55. He is not a cruel man, not a cartoonishly villainous overseer from a reforming pamphlet. He's a man of middle age who has worked in the match trade for 20 years, who knows the production process in its every detail, who can look at a tray of dipping paste and tell from the consistency and colour whether the temperature is right. He manages the workers as he was managed when he was a younger worker, with a mixture of reasonable expectation and sharp intolerance for anything that slows production, that the economics of piece-rate manufacturing require. He is not thinking about their health. That is not part of his job, and no one has told him it should be. The foreman's position in the industrial hierarchy of the match factory is, in itself, a product of the same economic logic that produced the dipping room. He earns more than the dipping room workers, substantially more. He has the power to dismiss workers for cause, to reduce wages through the fine system, to determine the pace of work and the assignment of tasks within the daily schedule. He is accountable upward to the factory manager, and ultimately to the owners and shareholders who regard the factory as an investment and measure its success in terms of output and margins. He has been in the trade long enough to have seen the jaw. He does not think about it systematically, because systematic thinking about occupational hazards was not in the 19th century a normal part of industrial management's self-conception. But he has seen workers leave the dipping room for the last time, their faces swollen, their usefulness to the factory ended by a condition he has no name for and no explanation of. He files this away somewhere and gets on with the work. There is no alternative available to him. He cannot change the chemistry. He cannot improve the ventilation beyond what the factory's construction allows. He can tell the workers to wash their hands more often, which he sometimes does, without being certain why it might help or whether it helps at all. He is not a villain. He is a man occupying a position in a system that has not been designed to prioritize the welfare of the workers who move through it, and his behavior is almost entirely predicted by the nature of that position. A different foreman, in this factory in this year, would do almost exactly the same things. The system produces this outcome not because of the personal failings of the individuals within it, but because of the incentive structures and the power relationships that define what each role is for and what success in each role looks like. This is worth understanding because the history of industrial harm is sometimes told as a story of villains, of individual owners and managers who were uniquely cruel or uniquely negligent, when the more accurate and more uncomfortable account is the one that shows ordinary people doing ordinary jobs within systems that were structured to produce harm as a predictable outcome of their normal operation. The foreman of the dipping room in 1860 is not a special case. He is a representative instance. Inside, the factory divides into a series of rooms, each with a specific function in the long, careful process of making a match. The wood room is on the ground floor and it is the loudest room in the building. Long planks of poplar or aspen, soft-grained and light, arrive on the cart each morning and are fed through mechanical cutters that reduce them first to thin sheets and then to individual splints of the right length and thickness. The machines that do this work are noisy and demanding of attention. The workers who tend them learn quickly the small constant adjustments of angle and pressure that keep the wood feeding smoothly, and they learn with equal speed the particular wrist motion that moves the hands back at exactly the right moment as the blade comes through. They perform this small educated flinch hundreds of times each day without conscious thought. After a few months, it is as automatic as breathing. The floor of the wood room is permanently thick with fine sawdust. It collects in the corners and along the edges of the machinery, and on the clothing of anyone who works there, working its way into collars and cuffs and the folds of skirts, rising in small clouds when disturbed, catching in the back of the throat in a way that is not painful but is persistent. The workers breathe it. It is just another thing to breathe. There are worse rooms in the factory. The splints travel upward through the building on trays, dusted lightly with flour to keep them from sticking together, until they reach the dipping room on the upper floors. The dipping room is where the phosphorus lives. It is a long room, its ceiling lower than you might expect, its windows small and set high in the walls, and, for most of the working day, closed or nearly so. The phosphorus mixture is sensitive to temperature variation and to draft, and the foremen who oversee production prioritize the consistency of the product above the quality of the air. There are gas lamps mounted at intervals along both walls, burning steadily from the moment work begins regardless of the season or the light outside, because even on a bright summer afternoon, the windows do not admit enough natural light to work by at the necessary level of precision. The smell in the dipping room is distinctive. It is not sulphurous in the straightforward way of struck matches, not the sharp acid smell of combustion. It is something more complex and more persistent, a smell that is difficult to describe to someone who's not encountered it, partway between something faintly organic and something unmistakably chemical, with a slight sweetish undertone that is in some ways more unsettling than a purely unpleasant smell would be. The workers who have been in the room for more than a few weeks barely register it any longer. It is simply the smell of work. It is simply what the air tastes like in here. Along both sides of the room are long wooden trestle tables, their surfaces worn smooth and stained with years of use. On the tables sit the dipping trays, shallow rectangular containers filled with phosphorus paste, the paste kept at the right consistency by gentle heat applied from beneath through a system of hot water pipes laid under the table surface. The paste is a pale yellow-white, translucent as old candle wax, and in the lamplit room it has a slightly luminous quality, a faint suggestion of its own light, though you have to look at it carefully and from the right angle to see it. The workers dip the splints by hand, or more commonly by guiding them through mechanical frames, metal grids that hold multiple rows of splints in position simultaneously, and can be lowered into the paste trays and raised again in a single operation, coating 100 or more match heads at once. The mechanical frames are a recent improvement, introduced over the past decade to reduce both the labour involved and the amount of direct hand contact with the paste. They are better than what came before, but even with the frames, the work is intensely hands-on. Splints that are not properly seated in the frames must be adjusted by hand. Paste that has accumulated at the wrong angle on the frame teeth must be corrected. Trays that overflow or cool unevenly must be managed. Loaded frames must be carried from the dipping table to the drying racks, and the movements, though not heavy, are constant and require careful attention. And the phosphorus is always present, in the tray in front of the worker, in the faint haze that rises from the tray's surface as the paste oxidizes slowly in contact with the air, in the residue on the table surface and the frame edges and the cloth the worker uses to wipe her hands between operations, in the very faint, almost imperceptible cloud of vapour that the room maintains regardless of the season, the vapour that is present in every breath taken in the dipping room, every hour of every working day, 6 days a week. From the dipping room, the loaded frames travel to the drying racks, long-tiered structures that fill the far end of the room and part of the corridor outside it, where the fresh match heads dry slowly in the warm air generated by the heating pipes. The drying process takes several hours. During this time, the matches must be checked periodically, the frames turned or adjusted if uneven drying appears, the racks monitored for the rare but dangerous possibility of spontaneous ignition. This last hazard was one the factory management took seriously, and for understandable reasons. White phosphorus ignites spontaneously in air at a temperature of roughly 34 degrees Celsius, a temperature well within the range achievable in a poorly ventilated industrial room with heating pipes and accumulated paste residue on every surface. Factory fires were not common, but they were not unknown, and a fire in a room full of phosphorus paste and wooden splints had the character of a very serious event indeed. The precautions taken against fire were substantial. The precautions taken against the daily, invisible, cumulative harm of the vapour were considerably less substantial. After drying, the matches travel to the boxing room, which occupies the 3rd floor and is in most respects a more pleasant working environment than the dipping room. The windows are larger here, the smell is milder, a residual chemical presence rather than the concentrated atmosphere of the dipping floor. The work is repetitive and finely muscled, the filling of small boxes with matches counted and arranged to the satisfaction of the foreman, who checks each batch before it is sealed. The boxing room workers are mostly the younger women and girls. Their fingers are quick and reliable, and they have learned the particular rhythm of the task, the smooth, sequential motion of counter-range close that can be sustained for hours at the pace required to meet the daily target. They talk more freely here than in the dipping room because the work is quieter and the foreman less strictly present. There are friendships in the boxing room and the particular texture of working-class women's community in the mid-Victorian period. The network of practical mutual support and shared knowledge and carefully maintained solidarity that made the impossible margins of working life manageable for those who had nothing else to rely on. The working day in the dipping room has a rhythm that the workers come to know as well as they know any rhythm in their lives, as well as the rhythm of their own sleep, as well as the rhythms of the neighbourhood outside the factory walls. The morning begins with the preparation. The paste trays are uncovered, and the temperature is checked, and the frames are loaded with the splints that have been waiting overnight, and the first batches of the day are the test of whether the overnight temperature in the paste has been maintained correctly, whether the drying racks are properly cleared from the previous day's production, whether the morning is going to run smoothly, or is going to begin with the small delays and corrections that a factory morning sometimes requires. By mid-morning the rhythm is established. The frames move in their regular sequence, from the loading table to the paste tray to the drying rack, the steady repeated motion of production at pace. The gas lamps burn steadily. The smell is at its most concentrated in the late morning hours before the windows opened a crack to let in the November air. The workers know each other's movements by now, can anticipate what the person at the next station is about to do, and can adjust their own movements accordingly without looking up or speaking. The morning is the best part of the working day in the dipping room, before the afternoon tiredness begins to accumulate in the lower back and the shoulders and the wrists, before the gas lamps begin to smoke slightly in the closed air of the room, before the light outside the high windows has gone through its brief afternoon brightness, and begun its decline toward the early evening dark. The morning is when the work can feel almost satisfying in its rhythm, almost like a kind of expertise rather than simply a kind of endurance. At midday, the factory pauses. The workers eat where they can, some in the yard if the weather permits, some at their workstations, some in a small room on the ground floor that is not really a dining room, but serves as one by default, being the largest unoccupied space in the building during the dinner break. The food is modest, and the time is not long, and the afternoon begins again before the full relief of the break has settled properly into tired backs and shoulders. Many of the dipping room workers eat at the dipping tables, with the trays covered but not removed, because the dinner break is not long enough to justify the time spent going downstairs and back up again. This habit, which no one has instituted and no one has forbidden, increases exposure beyond what the working hours alone would produce. The workers eating their bread and dripping at the phosphorus tables are breathing the room's atmosphere across the full length of their dinner break. It is not remarked upon, it is simply what happens. At 6 in the evening the day ends. The workers leave through the same gate they entered, in the same small groups and the same solitary walkers, moving out into the street that is now darker than it was at 6 in the morning. The walk home at the end of a 10-hour day in the dipping room has a different quality from the walk in. The morning walk is anticipatory, the body not yet committed to the hours ahead, the mind still at least partially in the domestic space it left behind. The evening walk carries the weight of the completed day, the specific tiredness of 10 hours of standing and reaching and carrying and attending, a tiredness that settles into the lower back and the feet, and the particular muscles of the hands and forearms that have been doing the work of the frames and the trays. But it is also a transition, and transitions have their own quality of relief. The gate closes behind the last worker. The street receives her. The factory is behind her now, and will be behind her until 6 tomorrow morning, and between now and then there are the hours that belong to something other than production. The house and the family and the supper and the particular texture of an evening, in a small room in a narrow street in the East End of London, which has its own warmth and its own community and its own forms of pleasure and consolation that are not diminished by being modest. The women who walk home through these streets after 10 hours in the dipping room are not walking home to nothing. They are walking home to everything that their lives outside the factory contain, the children and the neighbours and the conversations and the simple ordinary pleasures that make any life more than the sum of its working hours. This is part of what is taken from them by the disease that the factory gives them, not only the physical function, but the fullness of the daily life they return to at 6 in the evening, the life that becomes progressively more constrained as the jaw condition advances and eating becomes painful and sleep becomes difficult, and the ordinary activities of an ordinary evening require more effort and produce less pleasure than they did before. What the disease takes, in other words, is not merely health in an abstract sense, but the specific texture of these specific lives, the particular quality of an evening walk through a familiar neighbourhood, the particular pleasure of a meal eaten without pain, the particular rest of a night's sleep uninterrupted by the bone's complaint. At 6 in the evening, the day ends. The workers leave through the same gate they entered, in the same small groups and the same solitary walkers, moving out into the street that is now darker than it was at 6 in the morning, the gas lamps on the corners casting yellow circles on the wet cobblestones. The evening walk home is the reverse of the morning walk, through the same streets, past the same rag and bone yard and the same chandler's shop, back toward the rooms and the families and the particular set of domestic concerns that have been waiting patiently all day. The factory has its own ecology, as all workplaces do. There are hierarchies of space and status that the workers navigate as naturally and continuously as they navigate the physical layout of the building itself. The dipping room workers occupy a specific position in this hierarchy, one determined by the essential nature of their work, the fact that the dipping room is where the matches are actually made, where the defining chemical transformation occurs, where the skill of the process is most concentrated. This gives the dipping room a certain prestige alongside its hazard. The work is more valued in the internal economy of the factory than the boxing work or the clerical work. The wages reflect this. But prestige has a cost. The dipping room workers are the workers most exposed to the phosphorus. Their hands are the hands most in contact with the paste, their faces the faces closest to the open trays, their lungs the lungs that breathe the thickest concentration of the room's particular air. The wage differential that marks their higher status is also, though nobody frames it this way, a premium for the harm they are absorbing on behalf of the factory's production. There is a particular camaraderie among the dipping room workers that is different from the camaraderie of the boxing room, a solidarity built on shared proximity to a shared risk that they understand in practical terms even if they do not understand it in clinical ones. When a new worker starts in the dipping room, the older workers watch her with an attention that she may initially interpret as surveillance or judgment, but that is in fact something more protective than that. They know what the room does to a person over time. They cannot tell her in specific terms because they do not have the specific terms, but they watch and they note, and they have conversations among themselves in the dinner break or on the walk home that the new worker is not yet part of. There are things they know how to do that reduce the exposure slightly: eating at a distance from the trays, washing the hands more carefully and more often than is strictly required by the work, standing a certain way relative to the draught from the single window that is sometimes opened a crack in summer. These practices move through the workforce not as formal instruction, but as informal knowledge, person to person, winter to winter, as the community of the dipping room accumulates and transmits its understanding of what the room asks of those who work in it. On summer evenings, when the light in the dipping room begins to fail and the gas lamps are not quite compensating for the dropping of the daylight, something happens that visitors to the factory sometimes find alarming, and the regular workers have long since learned to take as ordinary. The faces of the workers begin to glow. Not brightly, not dramatically, not with anything resembling the theatrical luminescence of the phosphorescent sea creatures illustrated in the natural history journals of the period, just faintly, just at the edges of visibility, just enough to be unmistakable if you are looking for it in the right quality of light. A pale, greenish-white luminescence rising from the skin of cheeks and foreheads and the backs of hands, from the fabric of aprons and the fibres of hair, from the drying racks loaded with freshly dipped match frames along the far wall of the room. It is the phosphorus, oxidizing slowly in contact with air and emitting light in the process, the same cold chemiluminescence that Hennig Brand observed 2 centuries ago in his Hamburg laboratory and called cold fire. It is harmless, the foremen say, if they say anything at all. It is just the nature of the thing. It washes off. It does not hurt. And it does wash off, largely. A good washing with soap and water before bed removes most of it. By morning the glow is gone, and the worker returns to the factory looking as ordinary as anyone else on the street. But the vapour that produced the surface glow has been doing something else, something that does not wash off, something that the soap and water and the morning light cannot reverse. It has been going into the lungs with every breath, and from the lungs it has been finding its way into the blood, and from the blood into the tissues, and from the tissues toward the places in the body where it is most destructive. In the bones of the jaw, specifically. In the dense living tissue of the mandible, where it accumulates over months and years of exposure, where it interferes with the normal processes of bone maintenance and repair, where it begins, slowly and at first invisibly, to do the particular damage that will eventually have a name. The specificity of the jaw as the target organ is one of the features of phossy jaw that the early physicians found both clinically useful and scientifically interesting. Other organs were affected in cases of severe white phosphorus exposure, the liver in particular showing characteristic changes in post-mortem examinations of fatal cases, and the kidneys occasionally. But the jaw was where the disease was most visibly manifest, most consistently present, most diagnostically certain. Why the jaw? The answer lies in anatomy and in the specific route of exposure. The jawbone, unlike most other bones in the body, is in continuous indirect communication with the external environment through the teeth. The dental pulp and the periodontal ligament, the tissue that anchors each tooth in its socket, are exposed to whatever is present in the mouth. When a tooth is decayed or infected or recently extracted, this communication is more direct still. The socket of a recently pulled tooth is essentially an open pathway from the mouth to the underlying bone. In a dipping room worker breathing white phosphorus vapour for hours each day, the vapour dissolved in the saliva and in the mucous membranes of the mouth, found the pathways that decay and extraction had opened, and migrated into the jawbone along those pathways. The bone was therefore receiving a concentrated local dose of phosphorus through the dental roots, as well as the systemic dose arriving through the lungs and the blood. This combination of local and systemic exposure made the jaw particularly vulnerable to the toxic effects that the element produced. The mechanism by which phosphorus damaged bone was not fully understood in the 1840s when Lawrence described the clinical picture, but the clinical description was accurate enough to be acted on regardless of whether the mechanism was understood in detail. It did not matter, for the purpose of prevention, whether the exact molecular pathway by which phosphorus disrupted osteoclast and osteoblast activity had been characterized. What mattered was that white phosphorus caused the disease and red phosphorus did not, and this was demonstrably true from the factory records of Denmark and Sweden before any molecular mechanism had been proposed. The science of prevention did not require the science of mechanism. It required only the correlation between the chemistry and the outcome, and that correlation had been established clearly by 1850 at the latest. Everything that followed was a failure of implementation, not a failure of knowledge. The workers walking home through the East End evening do not know this yet, not in the specific, documented, medically confirmed sense that could be acted upon. But they know more than they are sometimes given credit for knowing. The communities of the match factory workers were not passive, unknowing populations being harmed by forces entirely invisible to them. They were observant communities, attentive to what happened to the people they worked alongside, possessed of a practical understanding of cause and effect that did not require clinical training to develop. They knew the jaw happened in the dipping room and not in the boxing room. They knew it happened to people who had been in the dipping room for a long time rather than those who had been there briefly. They knew the glow on their skin at the end of a shift was connected to the same substance that caused the jaw, because the glow was most visible on the workers who were closest to the paste, and the workers who were closest to the paste were the workers most likely to develop the jaw over time. The connection between the glow and the disease was understood in their community as a practical matter of observed pattern, even in the absence of any formal chemical explanation for it. What they could not do with this knowledge, in the industrial and legal environment of the 1860s and 70s, was anything that changed the situation. They could be careful, within the limits of the work, and many were. They could warn newcomers, gently and obliquely, in the way that established workers convey institutional knowledge to new ones, without wanting to frighten them away from the only available wages. They could, in extreme cases, leave the dipping room for other factory work or other kinds of work entirely, though this was easier for some than for others depending on their specific household circumstances. But they could not compel the factory to change its chemistry. They did not have that power, and they would not have it until the specific circumstances of the summer of 1888, 20 years and more down the line from the period we're in now, gave them an opening they had not previously had. The workers walking home through the East End evening do not know this yet, not in the specific, documented, medically confirmed sense that could be acted upon. They know about the jaw, the older women know about the jaw. It is a piece of knowledge that moves through the workforce the way all practical knowledge moves in a community of working people, not in formal communications but in quiet conversations at dinner breaks and on the walk home, in the particular careful attention that an experienced worker pays to a younger colleague who has been in the dipping room for a couple of years and whose jaw is looking different. But the factory does not know about the jaw, or chooses not to know, which from the worker's perspective amounts to the same thing. The production continues. The trays of phosphorus paste are prepared and warmed and loaded with frames each morning. The splints are dipped and dried and boxed. The matches are packed into crates and loaded onto carts and dispatched to the wholesalers and the shops and the export warehouses. And the vapour rises from the trays patient and invisible, and the workers breathe it and the years go by. Outside, the street is quiet now. The factory windows dark, the gas lamps burning at the corners, the city settling into its particular industrial night. A cat moves along the base of the rag and bone yard wall. Somewhere a child cries briefly and then stops. The river smell comes up from the south on the wind, muddy and cold and ancient. Tomorrow the factory will open at 6. The workers will arrive, the trays will be warmed, the work will begin again. The architecture of this daily repetition is worth slowing down to consider. Not for drama, because there is nothing dramatic about it from the outside. It is ordinary in the way that all industrial labour of the period was ordinary, in the way that all labour conducted under the pressure of economic necessity is ordinary, in the way that survival arranged around fixed wages and inflexible hours becomes simply the texture of days and seasons without particular beginning or end. But inside that ordinary exterior, inside the bodies of the workers who repeated this daily circuit year after year, something was accumulating that was not ordinary at all. The phosphorus vapour did not announce itself. It did not produce immediate symptoms that could be connected without effort to the dipping room. It entered the body quietly, through the lungs and the tissues of the mouth, finding its way by the slow, incremental chemistry of repeated low-level exposure toward the destination where it would cause its distinctive harm. A worker in her first year in the dipping room carried the vapour through her day and went home and slept and came back and did not feel anything specifically wrong. A worker in her third year might have a toothache she attributed to the cold weather. A worker in her fifth year might have a face that was changing in ways she did not have words for, or had only the words her workmates had given her. The factory building itself has long since been demolished. The street it stood on was rebuilt in the mid-20th century, and then again after that, and the particular configuration of rag and bone yard and chandler's shop and narrow public house that formed its immediate neighbourhood exists now only in the descriptions that survive in old documents and in the memory of the neighbourhood before its transformation. There is nothing to stand before and look at. There is no plaque, or if there is, it marks something other than this particular factory on this particular street. But the workers who moved through those rooms, up and down the stairs from woodroom to dipping room to boxing room and back down again, carrying the frames and loading the trays and boxing the matches and taking their wages at the end of the week and doing it all again the following Monday, they were real people in a real building that stood in a real street in an actual city, and the harm that accumulated in their bodies in those rooms was as real as the building itself, and more lasting. The matchbox on the shelf, the matchbox in every kitchen in every city in England and France and Germany and Austria, and the growing cities of North America, each one a product of rooms like the one on this East End street, each one carrying, invisibly, in the fact of its existence, the daily labour of the people who made it, and the daily accumulation of the harm that the making cost them. Strike it, the flame appears, the candle catches, the room fills with light. The box is placed back on the shelf, the transaction is complete, the factory is very far away. To understand what was happening in the bodies of the matchworkers, you need to understand something about the element that was being inhaled, and about the particular mechanisms through which it caused harm. This is not a difficult science to grasp in its broad outlines. The clinical picture it produces is not complicated, and the understanding available to physicians from the 1840s onward was, in its essential structure, correct. Phosphorus exists in several different forms called allotropes, which share the same atomic composition but differ in their molecular structure and, consequently, in their physical properties and their behaviour in the world. White phosphorus is the simplest form. It is what you get when phosphorus vapour condenses, the direct product of the basic processes of production available in the early 19th century. It is a waxy, yellowish-white solid at room temperature, translucent and slightly greasy to the touch, with a faint but distinctive smell. It is highly reactive. It ignites spontaneously in air when the temperature rises slightly above room temperature. When it burns, it produces a dense white smoke of phosphorus pentoxide, which is itself reactive and absorbs water vapour to form phosphoric acid. The flame of burning white phosphorus is extraordinarily difficult to extinguish, because the element continues to react with the oxygen in the surrounding air regardless of what else is done to it. In water, white phosphorus is relatively stable, which is why it was stored and transported submerged in liquid. In air, it reacts immediately and continuously, oxidizing at its surface and releasing that faint glow that Hennig Brand observed, the cold light that is the visible sign of the chemical reaction occurring at the boundary between the solid phosphorus and the surrounding atmosphere. It is this same oxidation that was occurring in the dipping rooms of every match factory that used white phosphorus paste. The paste was not sealed from the air. It could not be, given the nature of the process, which required the workers to have their hands and faces in close proximity to the open trays for hours at a time. The paste surface was continuously generating phosphorus vapour. The vapour was continuously present in the room, and the workers were continuously breathing it. Red phosphorus is a different matter entirely. It is a darker, more stable form of the element, produced by heating white phosphorus in the absence of air to temperatures above 250 degrees Celsius. The structural difference between the two forms is significant. red phosphorus does not ignite spontaneously. It does not oxidize in air at room temperature. It does not produce phosphorus vapor under working conditions. It is, in the specific sense relevant to the match factory, essentially non-toxic. Workers in factories using red phosphorus did not develop phossy jaw. The contrast was absolute, and it was documented. Anton von Schrotter, an Austrian chemist working in Vienna, identified and characterized red phosphorus in 1845, the same year that the first clinical descriptions of phossy jaw were appearing in the medical literature. The coincidence of timing was not noted with any great urgency by the match industry, which continued using white phosphorus for another 65 years. The chemistry for a safe alternative was available from the very moment the medical hazard was first formally described. Phosphorus necrosis of the jaw, which is the clinical name for phossy jaw, follows a characteristic progression that the physicians of the 1840s described accurately, and that subsequent decades of observation confirmed in factory after factory across Europe and North America. The pathway into the body begins with the teeth. The mucous membranes of the mouth and the spaces around the roots of the teeth, particularly teeth that are decayed, infected, or recently extracted, provide a route by which phosphorus vapor can reach the bone of the jaw directly. Workers with dental disease were at substantially higher risk than those with healthy teeth, which created a cruel double vulnerability among the working population of the 19th century, where poor nutrition and limited dental care meant that tooth disease was essentially universal. The people most likely to work in the match factories were the people most likely to have the dental condition that made them most vulnerable to the factory's hazard. The working poor of Victorian England had teeth that were the product of diets low in calcium and high in sugars from the cheap imported cane sugar that had become a staple of the working class diet by the middle of the 19th century. Teeth that had never seen a dentist in any meaningful sense, because dentistry cost money and money was short. Teeth that ached periodically throughout life, in the quiet, persistent way of something that is slowly failing and that cannot be addressed properly because the cost of proper address is beyond reach. These were the teeth that made their owners vulnerable. These were the teeth that opened pathways for the phosphorus to follow. Once the phosphorus reached the jawbone, it began to interfere with the normal process of bone remodeling. Bone is not a static substance. It is continuously maintained by two complementary cell populations, osteoclasts that break down old bone tissue and osteoblasts that produce new bone to replace it. This remodeling process is how bone repairs itself after minor injury, adapts to changing physical demands, and maintains the health and structure of the skeleton throughout life. Phosphorus disrupts this balance. Under sustained exposure, the remodeling process fails. Dead bone tissue accumulates. The blood supply to portions of the jaw decreases. Infection, which the compromised tissue can no longer resist effectively, takes hold. The result is a progressive and extremely painful condition. It begins as a toothache, indistinguishable at first from the ordinary dental pain that the workers expected and endured as a matter of course. But it does not resolve as a toothache resolves, even when the tooth in question is extracted. The ache deepens and spreads along the jawline. The surrounding tissue begins to swell. The bone beneath the gum, when a physician eventually examines it, is soft and necrotic in areas, giving off the faint characteristic smell of dead tissue that the doctors of the period noted in their case descriptions with clinical precision. As the condition advances, the jaw may develop abscesses that burst through the skin, creating fistulas that discharge continuously. Sections of dead bone, called sequestra, may be expelled through these openings or must be surgically removed. The shape of the face changes. Eating becomes progressively more difficult and then, in advanced cases, nearly impossible. The constant pain and the restricted ability to take food produce weight loss and the general deterioration of health that prolonged pain and inadequate nutrition always produce. In the most advanced cases, particularly those in workers who had been exposed for many years before the disease was identified and the exposure ended, the disease was fatal. Not necessarily directly, though the infection and bone destruction could themselves kill in some cases. More commonly through the secondary effects of the condition, the inability to eat, the suppression of the immune system by chronic pain and malnutrition, the susceptibility to concurrent illness that the weakened body could no longer resist. The mortality figures from the Victorian match factories are difficult to reconstruct precisely, because record-keeping was not systematic, and many deaths were attributed to concurrent conditions rather than to the underlying occupational disease. But the physicians who treated large numbers of matchworkers were clear in their estimates. Lorenzer in Vienna in 1845 recorded a substantial proportion of his most advanced cases as fatal. Thomas Oliver in England in the 1880s found similar patterns. The disease killed a significant fraction of those it afflicted severely, and it afflicted a significant fraction of those who worked in the dipping rooms for long periods. It is worth pausing on the question of duration. The disease required prolonged exposure to develop in most cases. A worker who spent a few weeks in the dipping room was at very different risk from one who had spent 3 years there. This characteristic of the disease, its long incubation relative to the working conditions that produced it, contributed to the difficulty of establishing the causal connection in the minds of those who were not looking for it. The toothache that began in the second year of dipping room employment did not, to an untrained or unwilling observer, obviously connect to the dipping room work itself. By the time the full picture of the disease was manifest, a worker might have left the original factory, moved to a different one, or been dismissed for ill health. The documentation of the connection between any individual case and any individual workplace required the kind of systematic clinical investigation that had to be deliberately undertaken. Among the more disturbing features of the condition, and the one most often noted by those who wrote about it, was the luminescence of the diseased jaw in the dark. The phosphorus deposited in the bone continued to oxidize slowly, the same chemistry that made the match paste glow faintly on the dipping room trays. It was fainter in the bone, much fainter, visible only in complete darkness, and only to eyes that had adjusted fully to the absence of light. But it was present. Workers who woke at night with the jaw pain, turning to look at the ceiling in the dark of their rooms, could see the faint cold light of their own affliction. This detail, the glowing jaw in the dark, acquired a particular power in the accounts written about phossy jaw, both in the medical literature and in the reform journalism of the later 19th century. It was the detail that communicated more vividly than any statistical table or clinical description the specific nature of what was happening to these workers and the specific distance between their experience and the comfortable world of those who made the decisions about how the match industry would be regulated. The light in the bone. The cold fire that Brand had been amazed by in his Hamburg laboratory transferred now from alchemical curiosity to industrial hazard, from the wonder of the learned to the suffering of the poor. It is one of those historical images that stays with you, that you carry with you after you have encountered it, that illuminates something beyond the specific facts of the 19th century match industry. It asks a question that does not have a comfortable answer. How long does a harm have to be documented before it becomes unacceptable to allow it to continue? The physicians who described it did their work well. They wrote clearly, argued carefully, and reached the right conclusions. The science of phossy jaw, from first description to full understanding, was accomplished within a decade of the disease's first appearance. What was not accomplished was the translation of that science into the regulation that would have ended the exposure. That translation required not only knowledge but power, and the people with the knowledge were not always the people with the power, and the people with the power were not always inclined to use it in the direction the knowledge pointed. There is a particular kind of frustration that the history of phossy jaw produces in those who read it carefully, a frustration at the gap between the scientific clarity of the situation and the slowness of the response to it. The chemistry was simple. The disease was documented, the remedy was available. The pathway from knowledge to action was in principle short, and yet it took decades. Part of what makes this frustrating is the quality of the evidence that existed and was being ignored. Lorenzer's 1845 paper was not a preliminary speculation. It was a careful clinical description of a disease he had observed in multiple patients, with a clear account of its natural history, its characteristic features, its relationship to the occupation of those who suffered from it, and its mechanism of action. The paper has the quality of confidence that comes from a physician who has seen enough cases to know what he is looking at, and has thought carefully about what it means. And the papers that followed it, across the 1850s and 1860s and into the 1870s, reinforced Lorenzer's account rather than undermining it. The same disease, the same occupational pattern, the same chemical cause, documented independently in Vienna and Paris and London, and the industrial cities of the German states. The convergent testimony of multiple careful observers in multiple countries over multiple decades is, in medicine as in law, a powerful form of evidence. It was more than sufficient to establish the case. What it was not sufficient for, in the regulatory environment of the mid-19th century, was action. Because action required not only evidence, but a political and institutional will to act on evidence that was inconvenient for powerful economic interests, and that political will was not available for a long time. The physicians could write their papers, the reformers could cite those papers, the workers could suffer the disease, and the manufacturers could continue using the cheaper chemistry until something changed the calculation sufficiently to make change unavoidable. What eventually changed the calculation was a combination of factors: the accumulation of public awareness, the activity of organized workers, the development of an international regulatory framework, and the passing of enough time that the contrast between the continuing harm and the available remedy became impossible to explain away. None of these factors was sufficient alone. Together, eventually, they were. Behind the clinical descriptions and the chemical analyses and the factory inspection reports, there were people. Real, specific, named people who went to work each morning and came home each evening and lived their lives in the particular circumstances of the Victorian working class, and who were being harmed by that work in ways that the scientific record was beginning to document, but that the political and industrial systems of the time were not yet prepared to prevent. Let us stay with one of them. Call her Sarah. She's not a specific named individual, but she's composed from the genuine and documented experiences of the women who worked in the dipping rooms of the East End match factories in the years around 1870, whose cases appear in the records of the London hospital, and in the factory inspection reports, and in the testimony gathered by reformers in the decades that followed. She is, in the most important sense, real. Her experience is real. The things that happened to her happened to women whose names are in the archives. She's 18 years old when she begins work in the dipping room. She's come from the borough of Stepney, from a street of terraced houses where 4 or 5 families share a building designed for 2, where the upstairs rooms belong to a family of 8, and the downstairs rooms to a family of 6, and the question of who has access to the small backyard and when is negotiated on terms that can shift unpredictably, depending on the landlord's mood and the relative prosperity of the occupants at any given moment. Her father works on the docks, casual labour, good when the ships are in and poor when they are not, which means the household income has the quality of weather, sometimes sufficient and sometimes acutely not, and the family has learned to plan for the lean weeks as a matter of practical survival rather than prudence. Her mother takes in washing when the dock work is slow. Her older brother is already at a factory nearby, the kind of place that makes small metal components for industries whose names he does not know and whose products he has never seen assembled. Her younger sister is still in school, just barely, the last one in the family still managing it, because the family has decided collectively, in the way that families of that class and time made such decisions, that at least one of them will get further than the rest. Sarah is tall for her age and sensible in the way that older children in large working-class families tend to be, practical and attentive and not given to complaint, because complaint in a household with inadequate margins is a luxury that nobody can afford and that achieves nothing anyway. She has left school at 12. She has worked before in a laundry, and then in a glove-making workshop, small piecework operations that paid less than the match factory, and whose management was, if anything, less congenial. The match factory pays 12 shillings a week for dipping room workers, which is not a good wage, but it is a regular one, and regular is worth a great deal in a life where the alternative is casual. The work is not physically demanding in the way that dock labour is demanding. It does not require strength. It requires attention, which she has, and steadiness, which she has, and the ability to do the same thing repeatedly for 10 hours without losing the precision the task demands, which she also has. She is, in the judgment of the foreman who oversees the dipping room, a good worker. In the dipping room she learns the work quickly, the frames, the trays, the paste, the drying racks. The learning happens in layers, as all workplace learning does. The first layer is the physical learning, the particular movements and judgments and small manual skills that the work requires. How to load the frames without crowding the splints in the edges where the paste adhesion is uneven. How to carry a loaded frame without the wet heads brushing against anything. How to read the paste by its colour and consistency, and the way it flows off the frame edges to know whether the temperature is right without having to ask the foreman. These are things she learns in the first few weeks, through the particular combination of instruction from neighbouring workers, observation of those who have been doing the work longer, and the slow calibration of her own hands to the specific demands of the task. The second layer is the social learning. The culture of the dipping room, like the culture of every workplace, has its own unwritten rules and its own hierarchies and its own forms of mutual recognition and mutual support that are not explained but are quickly apparent to anyone paying attention. The women who have been in the dipping room longest are accorded a certain deference not merely by reason of seniority, but because they hold knowledge that is genuinely useful. Knowledge of how to manage the work under the different conditions that different seasons and different foremen produce. Knowledge of the foreman's particular sensitivities and how to avoid triggering them. Knowledge of who can be counted on for what when the pressure of production becomes uncomfortable. The third layer of learning is the hardest to name, because it is not taught and is not exactly observed. It is the gradual accretion of understanding about the nature of this particular workplace, the particular things it costs to work here, the particular compensations and risks and unspoken agreements that structure the daily experience of the dipping room. This layer of learning takes longer. Some of it is never made explicit at all. Some of it is embedded in the careful attention the older women pay to the newer ones, the glances that carry meaning that cannot be easily verbalized, the small acts of practical help that are offered without being asked for and accepted without comment. In the dipping room she learns the work quickly. The frames, the trays, the paste, the drying racks, the particular smell of the room, which strikes her in her first week as alien and unpleasant, and which by the end of her second month she has ceased to notice. The way the light changes through the day, bright in the morning when the gas lamps compensate for the absence of natural light, duller in the afternoon as the lamps are turned down slightly to conserve fuel, dimmer still in the early winter evenings when the light outside the small high windows fails before the working day ends. She eats her dinner in the dipping room because there is nowhere else to eat it on cold days, and because the dinner break is not long enough to justify the effort of going downstairs and back up. The bread and dripping that she has brought in her paper parcel is eaten sitting at the dipping table, with the phosphorus trays covered but not removed, with the phosphorus vapour still present in the room. This matters more than anyone in the factory has thought to say. In her first year, Sarah notices nothing wrong. She's young and well as a girl from Stepney in 1870 can be, which is not quite the same thing as the robustness available to someone with good nutrition and proper medical care, but is sufficient for the purposes of work and the ordinary business of her life. She goes to the factory, she comes home, she gives most of her wages to her mother, she keeps a small amount back for herself, not much, enough for a Saturday evening at the music hall with her friend from the boxing room, and the occasional purchase of a ribbon or a penny dreadful that she reads on Sunday afternoon beside the window of the room she shares with her sister. But before the toothache, there are other things that are present and that she notes but that she does not, at this stage, connect to the factory or the paste or the specific chemistry of the dipping room. There is a tiredness that is different in quality from the tiredness of hard work, a tiredness that does not fully resolve with sleep, that is present on Monday morning when the week has just begun, as it is present on Saturday evening when the week is over. She attributes this to the winter, or to the quality of the food she can afford, or to the particular dreariness of the season. It is the kind of tiredness that the Victorian working poor attributed to many things because they had no vocabulary for the specific ways that occupational exposure affects the body below the level of obvious symptom. There is a faint sensitivity in her gums, a tenderness that she notices when she brushes her teeth with the small amount of salt and the rag that is the general practice in her household, a tenderness that is not quite pain, but is more present than it was before. She is, by her own assessment, not entirely well in some way she cannot precisely identify. She's not sick in a way that stops her from working. She's not sick in a way that she would describe to anyone, because what she would say is simply that she is tired and her gums are sore, and this is not news in a household where everyone is more tired than they ought to be, and dental care is an unaffordable luxury. The factory does not ask whether she is well. The foreman's assessment of her is that she comes to work reliably and performs her task at the required pace, which is the assessment he makes of all the workers and which is the only assessment his role requires him to make. In her second year she notices the toothache. It begins in a back tooth on the left side of her lower jaw, a lower molar that has been slightly troublesome before, that ached occasionally during cold weather in the way that many teeth ached, for people whose diet did not include enough of whatever it is that teeth require to be entirely healthy. The ache is not severe at first. It is one of those background presences that you learn to work around, like a slightly stiff knee or a recurring headache, something that is there and is annoying and that you take note of and then get on with things despite. But it does not go away in the normal pattern of toothache. It deepens through the autumn of her second year, becoming more insistent, more specific, radiating along the left jawline in a way that ordinary toothache does not usually do. She asks her mother about it. Her mother says she needs the tooth seen to and asks how much that will cost and when they might have the money. In the second winter, the tooth was pulled. It cost sixpence she did not have easily, and the pulling was done in the back room of a nearby barber's shop by a man who was competent and not unkind, and was finished in under a minute. The pain of the extraction was vivid and brief. For 5 or 6 weeks afterwards she felt better. Then the swelling began. At first it was just a slight fullness in the tissue along the left side of her jaw, something she noticed more in the way her face felt to her own touch than in the way it appeared in the fragment of mirror above the wash basin. Not painful at first. Not really. Just present. Just different. Just the sense that the left side of her face was not quite the same as it had been before. She watched it. She said nothing about it at home, not wanting to alarm her mother, who had enough to worry about. She said nothing about it at the factory, where saying something about your health was a route to losing your position. By the following autumn the swelling was visible to others. Her mother noticed it on a Sunday and made a sound that was not quite a word but was full of a quality of recognition that Sarah could not interpret clearly at the time. Her neighbour asked about it carefully. At the factory, some of the older women looked at the left side of her face with an expression she had not known how to read when she first came, the one that contained a kind of still acknowledgement, a kind of sad recognition. She was losing weight, because eating was becoming difficult and painful, and because the combination of pain and anxiety was doing what it always does to appetite. She was sleeping badly, because the jaw pain, which was constant in the day and had been manageable, seemed to intensify in the quiet of the night when there was nothing else to attend to. One night, in the February of the year she turned 22, she woke in the dark at some hour past midnight, with the pain sharp and clear and specific in a way it had not been before, and lay still for a moment in the cold, dark room that she shared with her sister, and then turned her head toward the fragment of mirror on the wall and saw, in the absolute darkness of a February night with no moon and the window shuttered, the faint pale glow of her own face. Not bright, not like a lamp or a candle, just barely there, just present, just unmistakable once you were looking for it. The left side of her jaw faintly luminescent in the dark. She lay still for a long time, looking at it. She was not a person given to panic. She was a person given to endurance, as the workers of her class and her time almost universally were, because panic was a luxury that required leisure and safety, and she had neither. She thought about what the glow meant in practical terms. She thought about the women at the factory who had the jaw. She thought about what had happened to them. She thought about what would happen next. Then she closed her eyes because the pain was not worse than it had been, and she needed to be at the factory at 6 and thinking about it at 2 in the morning changed nothing that could be changed before morning. This was the nature of poverty in the 19th century, rendered very precisely in a moment like this one. Not theatrical suffering, not dramatic collapse. Quiet, practical endurance of suffering, because there was no other option, because the morning would come whether she had slept or not. She knew other women at the factory who had what the workers called by various names. The jaw, the factory sickness, the glow sickness. Most of them had left the dipping room eventually, some voluntarily when the disease made continued work impossible. Some because the management had decided that visibly sick workers reflected badly on the factory. A few had been sick enough to require the charity ward at the London hospital, the large infirmary in the Mile End Road, which treated the working poor of East London, and whose physicians were in the years around 1870, beginning to see enough cases to start, quietly, putting things together. The women who remained at the factory talked about the jaw carefully, in the way that people talk about a risk that is present and real, and that they cannot easily escape. Some had found ways to reduce their exposure, eating well away from the dipping room washing their hands more thoroughly, trying to work closer to whatever small ventilation the room provided. These were individual improvisations, not structural solutions, and their effectiveness was limited, but they were what was available. What was not available was information from the factory itself about the nature of the risk, about the mechanism of the harm, about the alternative chemistry that existed and could, in principle, make the dipping room safe. This information did not travel downward through the hierarchy of the factory. It did not appear on notices at the gate or in the brief exchanges between foreman and workers. It lived in places that the dipping room workers did not have access to and never would, unless something changed the architecture of the situation. Something was beginning to change, slowly in the 1870s and 80s, in the offices of the factory inspectorate, and in the meetings of medical societies, and in the correspondence of reformers, and in the consciousness of certain journalists and activists. The architecture was beginning to shift. The knowledge was beginning to find the routes toward action that it had not found before. But for Sarah, lying in the dark with the glow of phosphorus in her jaw on a February night in 1874, none of that was yet visible. The world she could see consisted of her immediate circumstances, and her immediate circumstances contained no obvious remedy and no clear path forward, only the day ahead and the one after it, and the slow accumulation of pain and time that was the specific texture of her particular life. The pain was changing, not in the sense that it was improving, but in the sense that it was evolving, finding new expressions, announcing its presence in ways it had not used before. There were nights when it was a deep, structural ache, the bone itself complaining from some interior depth that she had not known bones had. There were days when it flared unexpectedly at meals, when a bite of something hard would send a sharp, specific signal through the left side of her face that was quite different from the background constant. She learned to eat carefully, she learned to favour the right side, she learned the dozen small accommodations that a person under persistent pain learns, the adjustments and avoidances and strategic inattentions that allow you to continue functioning at the required level. She worked for another 6 months after that February night. Then the disease progressed to a point where the factory management decided she was no longer suitable for the dipping room. She was let go with a week's wages. She applied to the London hospital the following month. The London hospital in the Mile End Road was, in the 1870s, one of the largest voluntary hospitals in the world, a great sprawling institution that served the densely populated and deeply poor East End of London on a scale that no other medical institution in the vicinity could approach. It was founded in the 18th century and had grown steadily with the population it served, adding wards and departments and outpatient facilities as the East End expanded and the demand for medical care with no ability to pay for it grew correspondingly. The physicians who worked at the London hospital in the 1870s were, many of them, men of genuine distinction and real dedication to the medical problems presented by the working poor of the East End. They had seen everything: the full range of poverty's consequences, the diseases of malnutrition and overcrowding and industrial exposure and childhood illness, processed through the wards of the hospital in a continuous flow that required both clinical skill and a certain quality of practical equanimity to sustain. They knew phossy jaw when they saw it by the 1870s. They had seen enough cases to know the disease, to know its natural history, to know the occupational background that almost always accompanied it, to know that a woman in her 20s presenting with jaw swelling and a history of employment in a match factory was almost certainly presenting with phosphorus necrosis. They treated it as they could, which was to manage the infection and address the dead bone as surgically as they were able, and they recorded the cases in the hospital's records with the clinical detail appropriate to a teaching institution. What they could not do was follow their patients home and continue to document the longer arc of their lives. The hospital records capture the medical encounter, the presenting complaint and the clinical findings and the treatment administered. They do not capture what came after. Some patients recovered partial function and went on to work in other occupations that kept them away from the dipping rooms. Some did not recover and died. The hospital records end where the hospital's knowledge ended, at the point of discharge or death, and what followed is not there. She applied to the London hospital the following month. Her case was documented in the hospital's records briefly, in the clinical shorthand of the period. A notation of the presenting complaint, the history of factory employment, the degree of jaw involvement observed on examination. Her name is in those records, along with a dozen other names from the same factory, from the same years, from the same narrow set of streets. The records are in an archive, the archive is preserved, her name is there. Around her name, in the same archive, are other names. The London hospital records from the 1870s and 1880s contain a quiet concentration of entries from the same streets and the same factory district, entries for women in their 20s and 30s, with jaw complaints and factory employment in their histories. A physician working through these records in the late 1870s, looking for patterns rather than individual cases, would have found the pattern immediately. A physician looking for it found it. Several did. But the archive that contains her name also contains the gap between her individual experience and the moment when that experience became part of a larger narrative that could produce political change. Her case was documented in 1874. The Dangerous Trades Committee reports, which drew on accumulated evidence including records from hospitals like the one that treated her, were not published until the 1890s. The prohibition that those reports eventually helped produce did not come until 1910. Between the documentation of her specific case and the change that documentation contributed to, there were 36 years. She did not know this. She could not have known this. The arc of the reform was visible only in retrospect, only to someone standing at the far end of it looking back. To her, in 1874, there was only the present and whatever the present contained, the disease, the dismissal, the hospital, the uncertainty about what came next. What came next for individual workers with advanced phossy jaw varied. Some recovered partially, particularly those whose disease had not progressed to the most severe stages, whose treatment at the hospital or elsewhere managed to clear the infection sufficiently that some function returned. Some lost portions of their jaw to surgical removal, the dead and infected bone taken out piece by piece in operations that the anesthesia of the period made endurable, but did not make easy. Some died from the secondary effects of the condition, or from other diseases that found them in a weakened state. Their outcomes were not uniform because individual experience never is, not even within a shared condition and a shared set of circumstances. What was uniform was the cause. The same paste in the same trays in the same rooms, breathed day after day by women who needed the wages those rooms provided and who had no way to know, in the absence of information their employers chose not to provide, that the air they were breathing was doing something to them that the morning wash could not undo. That information existed. It was in the medical literature. It was in the inspection reports. It was in the conversations that the hospital physicians were having with each other and eventually beginning to have with reformers and journalists and parliamentary investigators. It was making its way, by the slow routes available to it, toward the people and the processes that could do something with it. The route was long. The distance it had to travel was greater than it should have been, but it was travelling. The women who worked in the match factories in the 1860s and 1870s and 1880s were part of a larger world of Victorian women's labour that is worth holding in view, because the specific situation of the match workers cannot be fully understood without that larger context. Women's industrial labour in the Victorian period was characterised by several structural features that shaped the experience of every woman who worked in a factory or a workshop. The wages were substantially lower than those paid to men for comparable work, sometimes by a factor of 2 or more, on the grounds, rarely questioned by those who benefited from it, that women's labour was less skilled or less valuable, or that women required a lower subsistence wage because they were assumed to have male relatives contributing to their support. The assumption was frequently wrong in practice, but it structured the wage scales regardless. Women's industrial work was also more precarious than men's in most trades, more easily terminated for ill health or pregnancy or simple managerial preference, less protected by the craft union structures that were beginning to give some male workers institutional leverage in disputes with employers. The match factories employed women precisely because the work could be done at lower wages and with less institutional protection than was available to organise male workers. This meant that the women of the dipping room were, from the perspective of the industrial and political system of the time, among the least powerful actors in the entire drama of the Phossy Jaw campaign. They were the people most harmed by the situation. They were also the people least positioned to change it directly, because they had neither the institutional power of organised labour nor the social and political power of the reformers and physicians who were beginning to advocate on their behalf. What they had was each other, and the knowledge that passed between them, and the daily act of going to work in rooms that harmed them because the alternatives were worse. This is not heroism in any conventional sense. It is something more ordinary and more durable, the endurance of people who have no good options and who continue to function, to care for their families, to maintain the texture of their lives under conditions that should not have been imposed on them. Sarah's name in the archive is one name. Around it are many others, each of them a life that contained more than the disease, more than the factory, more than the conditions that the reformers were trying to change. Each of them a person for whom the match factory was one part of a life that included streets and families and music halls on Saturday evenings, and the particular texture of a neighbourhood that had its own history and its own community, and its own forms of meaning that had nothing to do with Phosphorus or phossy jaw or the Dangerous Trades Committee. The disease did not define them, it happened to them. The distinction matters. The medical history of phosphorus necrosis of the jaw is a history of things known too early and acted on too late, which is perhaps the more common of the two possible failures of knowledge. The first clinical descriptions of what would eventually be called phossy jaw appeared in the medical literature of the German-speaking world in the 1840s, within a single decade of the first widespread production of white phosphorus matches. The timing was not coincidental. The physicians who worked in the cities where the match industry had established itself were seeing the disease because the disease was there to be seen, and they were doing their job, which was to describe what they observed and draw from those descriptions the conclusions that the evidence supported. A Viennese physician named Lorenzer published what is generally regarded as the foundational clinical description of the condition in 1845. He had access to workers from the Viennese match industry, which had established itself in the early 40s, and was growing rapidly to meet the demand of a city that, like every European city of the period, found the phosphorus match's convenience irresistible. He described the jaw pain, the swelling, the progressive bone involvement, the characteristic luminescence, the relationship to dental disease, and the connection to factory employment with a clarity and specificity that left no serious room for doubt about the nature of the condition or its cause. Other physicians in Vienna, in the German states, in France, and within a few years in England, were publishing similar observations. The disease presented the same way in each country, because it was caused by the same thing in each country, the white phosphorus paste of the dipping rooms, breathed daily by the workers who tended them. The consistency of the clinical picture across multiple independent observers in multiple countries was itself a form of evidence, the kind of convergent testimony that medicine has always regarded as strong. When physicians in Vienna and physicians in Lyon and physicians in London, working independently, describe the same disease with the same presenting features in the same occupational group, the conclusion that the disease has a single cause specific to that occupation is not difficult to reach. The connection between the occupation and the disease was not merely asserted by these early writers, it was argued from evidence. The patients were overwhelmingly match workers, and overwhelmingly workers from the dipping rooms rather than the boxing rooms or the wood rooms. The disease appeared in the jaw specifically, and in a pattern that made sense given the anatomy of dental disease as a potential entry route for the vapour-carried phosphorus. It appeared after years of exposure, not after brief contact. The longer a worker had been in the dipping room, the higher the risk. Workers in factories that had already made the transition to safer chemistry did not develop the disease. This was not ambiguous. Lorenzer and his contemporaries did not hedge their conclusions in the way that scientific writers sometimes do when they are less than fully certain. They said white phosphorus was the cause. They said the dipping rooms were the source of exposure. They said that removing workers from exposure stopped the progression in cases that had not yet reached an advanced stage. They said the disease was preventable if the exposure was prevented. They said this in language that was clear and specific and backed by clinical observation. They said this in 1845, and for 65 years, in country after country, the industry continued using white phosphorus, and the disease continued appearing in the workers who made the matches. The reception of Lorenzer's paper among his colleagues was, initially, the reception that a well-made clinical contribution tends to receive: serious attention, replication by others who went to look for the same disease in their own patient populations, and the gradual accumulation of a literature that confirmed his central findings while adding detail and nuance. This was science working as it is supposed to work, the initial observation sparking further investigation, the further investigation confirming and extending the initial observation, the body of knowledge growing and solidifying over time. What did not happen for a remarkably long time was the translation of this growing and solidifying body of knowledge into any change in the industrial practice that was causing the disease. The medical community knew. The reformers who read the medical literature knew. The factory inspectors who visited the factories and who sometimes read the medical literature knew. And the manufacturers, who had access to the same literature and whose own factory physicians were sometimes producing contributions to it, knew. The paper trail is extraordinary in its density and its clarity. From Lawrence's 1845 description through the accumulating European literature of the 1850s and 1860s, and into the systematic English investigations of the 1870s and 1880s, there is a continuous record of a community of physicians saying the same thing in increasingly detailed and well-documented terms. White phosphorus causes this disease. The disease is preventable. Here is how to prevent it. Please do this. The please do this part was ignored for 65 years. They said this in 1845, and for 65 years, in country after country, the industry continued using white phosphorus, and the disease continued appearing in the workers who made the matches. To understand why knowledge did not become action for so long, you need to understand the specific architecture of industrial regulation in the 19th century, which was not simply an absence of rules, but the presence of a particular set of rules organized around a particular set of principles. The dominant principle of industrial organization in the mid-Victorian period was freedom of contract. An employer hired workers at wages and under conditions to which the workers agreed. The agreement was deemed to be free in the sense that no worker was compelled by force to take any particular job. The implications of this principle for occupational safety were precisely what you might expect. The employer had no legal obligation to make work safe. The worker had no legal right to safe working conditions, and the state's role was to enforce the agreement reached between them rather than to prescribe its content. Factory legislation had been chipping away at this framework since the 1830s, but the chips were modest and the core remained largely intact through the middle decades of the century. The legislation that existed was concerned primarily with obvious physical hazards and with the most visible and politically salient abuses of child labour. It did not address the chemical environment of industrial workplaces in any systematic way. The concept that an employer might have a legal obligation to monitor and control the air his workers breathed was not part of the legal framework of the 1850s or 1860s. The factory inspectorate existed, and its officers visited match factories, and some of those officers were attentive enough to observe what was happening in the dipping rooms and to report it upward through the inspectorate. The inspectorate was itself a product of the reform impulse that had been reshaping Victorian governance since the 1830s, a recognition by the state that the conditions of industrial work required some form of public oversight that purely private contractual relationships could not provide. Its creation had been contested, its powers had been limited by the same freedom of contract doctrine that constrained the manufacturer's legal obligations, and its officers had been trained to look for certain kinds of hazards, primarily the physical hazards of machinery and structural safety, and the exploitation of child labour that were the primary concerns of the factory legislation under which they operated. Chemical hazards were in a different category, at the edge of the inspectorate's formal mandate, and outside the training that most of its officers had received. An inspector visiting a match factory in the 1850s or 1860s would know what he was looking at in the woodroom, would have a framework for assessing the safety of the machinery and the conditions of the workers in relation to it. He would have a much less clear framework for assessing what the air in the dipping room was doing to the workers who breathed it, even if he noticed the smell and even if he saw workers with the characteristic jaw changes. Some inspectors went beyond their formal training and made the connection. Their reports are in the archives, careful and concerned, recommending improved ventilation and expressing worry about the jaw condition they had observed. These were good reports, accurately describing what was happening. They were filed. They accumulated. They were read within the inspectorate by people who had limited authority to act on them. They were not transmitted in any systematic way to the manufacturers they described. The gap between the inspector's report and the manufacturer's practice was bridged by nothing. There was no mechanism for converting a concerned inspector's observations into a legal obligation on the part of the manufacturer to change anything. The inspector could write. The manufacturer was not required to respond. The workers continued to breathe the vapour. The reports continued to accumulate. The factory inspectorate existed, and its officers visited match factories, and some of those officers were attentive enough to observe what was happening in the dipping rooms and to report it upward through the inspectorate. These reports are in the archives. They describe the conditions clearly. They recommend improved ventilation. They note the cases of jaw disease among workers. They suggest that the substitution of a safer chemical might be considered. These reports travelled upward and stopped moving. They entered the bureaucratic body of the inspectorate and lay there, not acted on, because acting on them would have required legislation that the political climate of the time would not support, and because the inspectorate did not have the authority on its own to compel manufacturers to change their chemistry. The manufacturers occupied a confident position. They were producing a product the public bought in large quantities. The specific character of that confidence is worth examining, because it was not simply arrogance or indifference. It was confidence backed by a legal framework, an economic reality, and a set of cultural assumptions about the relationship between employer and worker that were, in the 1850s and 1860s, not yet seriously challenged in the mainstream of political and commercial life. The legal framework, as discussed, gave the manufacturers the protection of freedom of contract. The worker who took employment in a dipping room was held to have accepted the conditions of that employment, and the employer had no legal obligation to disclose what those conditions might eventually do to the worker's jaw. This was not a controversial interpretation of the law at the time, it was the law as it stood. The economic reality was that the match trade was profitable and the public wanted matches. Any politician who considered pressing for regulation of the industry's chemistry faced the certain opposition of the manufacturers and the uncertain response of a public that might or might not regard the occupational hazards of match workers as a matter requiring government intervention in what was otherwise a successful commercial enterprise. The calculation was not straightforward, and the politicians who made it in the 1850s and 1860s generally resolved it in the direction of non-intervention. The cultural assumptions were perhaps the most powerful of the three, because they were the least visible and the most taken for granted. The assumption that the health costs of industrial production were, to some extent, naturally borne by industrial workers, that this was the character of the work and that the workers had chosen it, and were compensated for it through their wages, was not articulated as a policy position in most discussions of the match industry. It did not need to be. It was simply the background against which the discussions took place, the unexamined premise that shaped what questions were asked and what answers were regarded as acceptable. When that background changed, as it was slowly changing through the reform movements and the Factory Acts and the growing public awareness of industrial conditions that the Victorian period produced, the calculation shifted too. The manufacturers found themselves arguing in a different context, one in which the unexamined premises were beginning to be examined, one in which the freedom of contract doctrine was meeting more resistance, and the duty of care concept was beginning to find expression in both legal and public discourse. The manufacturers occupied a confident position. They were producing a product the public bought in large quantities. They were employing workers who, in the formulation of the time, had freely contracted to work under the conditions offered. The disease that affected a portion of their workforce was, in their private assessment, an unfortunate but statistically limited hazard of a legitimate industrial process, and the possibility of addressing it through chemistry was not seriously on their operational agenda. In France, the situation had additional features worth noting. The French match industry was, for much of the century, a state monopoly, which meant that the government of France was simultaneously the regulator of the industry and its owner and operator. This created a structural conflict of interest that manifested in precisely the way that structural conflicts of interest always manifest, by making it very difficult for the regulatory function to act against the operational function. The revenue from the match monopoly was significant. The welfare of the match workers was not, in the calculus that the French state applied to the question, equally significant. Meanwhile, the scientific understanding of the mechanism of the disease was deepening and becoming more precise. By the 1870s and 80s, physicians like Thomas Oliver in England were conducting systematic investigations that went beyond clinical description into a more detailed epidemiological analysis of the relationship between exposure patterns and disease incidence. Oliver's work was careful and methodical, and produced findings of real clarity. He could demonstrate from his data the relationship between years of dipping room employment and risk of developing phossy jaw. He could demonstrate the higher risk associated with pre-existing dental disease. He could compare the disease rates in different factories in different countries. He could, and did, compare the disease rates in factories using white phosphorus with the essentially zero rate in factories that had moved to safety matches. This last comparison was the most powerful single piece of evidence in the entire campaign against white phosphorus. It was also, by the 1880s, easily made because the safety match trade was well established, and the transition was clearly commercially viable. The Swedish model, the red phosphorus safety match developed by Lundström in 1854, was by now 30 years old and had been widely adopted in Scandinavia. Factories using safety match chemistry did not produce phossy jaw cases. Factories using white phosphorus did. The comparison was direct and its meaning was clear. It was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, with a straight face, that the disease could not be prevented. The evidence that it could be prevented was now sitting alongside the evidence of its continued occurrence in the factories that had chosen not to prevent it. The Dangerous Trades Committee, established in England in the 1890s to investigate occupational hazards in British industry, produced reports on the match industry that made the same arguments in language now backed by decades of accumulated evidence. The committee's 1895 and 1898 reports were thorough, well-sourced and deeply unflattering to the match manufacturers. They documented the disease, demonstrated its preventability, and called for action. More action was not immediately forthcoming, but the reports were read by people beyond Parliament. They were read by reformers and journalists and trade union organisers and members of the public who had not previously been aware of the specific details of what was happening in the match factories. They were read by people who found the gap between the demonstrated knowledge and the continued inaction difficult to accept as a reasonable state of affairs. The physicians wrote their papers, the reformers read them, the workers were sick and some were dying, the matchboxes sat on the shelves. The disconnect between the medical record and the industrial practice was not invisible, even to those who were not specialists in either medicine or industrial regulation. Thoughtful observers of Victorian industrial life, the social investigators like Charles Booth and Henry Mayhew, whose work was beginning to document the conditions of the poor with a systematic thoroughness that had not been attempted before, noted the match trade in their surveys. They noted the wages, the conditions, the workers, and occasionally, with the descriptive care that characterised their method, the disease that moved through the dipping room workforce at a rate that could not be explained by the general ill health of the East End population. What distinguished these observers' accounts from the physicians' accounts was their audience. The physicians were writing for other physicians and for the administrators and regulators who read medical literature as part of their professional briefs. The social investigators were writing for the broader educated public, for the readers of serious periodicals and the buyers of substantial social scientific volumes who were engaged with the question of how the poor lived and what could be done about the conditions in which they lived. This broader audience did not have the specific technical knowledge to evaluate the chemistry of the match trade, but it had the general moral intelligence to understand that a disease documented for 40 years and connected to a preventable industrial cause was not an acceptable condition of the trade. The physicians wrote their papers, the reformers read them, the workers were sick and some were dying, the matchboxes sat on the shelves. The workers themselves occupied a particular epistemological position in this structure that is worth examining carefully, because it is often overlooked in the histories that focus on what the physicians knew, and what the manufacturers knew, and what the parliamentarians knew. The workers knew things that the physicians and the manufacturers and the parliamentarians did not know, and they knew them in a more immediate and more personal way than any other group. They knew what the dipping rooms smelled like from inside. They knew what it felt like to spend 10 hours a day in that room. They knew which tasks brought them closest to the paste, and which kept them at a slight remove. They knew who among their number had the jaw, and roughly how long those women had been in the dipping room before the jaw appeared, and roughly what the progression looked like once it started. They knew the names the disease was called by the women who had it, and by the women who watched them have it. They knew all of this in the way that people who live inside a situation know it, in the body and in the daily fabric of experience. What they did not know, because no one had told them and they had no access to the medical literature or the inspection reports, was the chemical explanation for what they were seeing. They knew the jaw was connected to the factory. The older women knew this even if they did not use the word phosphorus and could not have described the mechanism of bone remodeling disruption. They knew that women who worked in the dipping room got the jaw and women who did not work in the dipping room did not get the jaw, and that this was not a coincidence. But they did not have the specific knowledge that would have told them that the chemistry could be changed, that the disease was preventable, that a different paste in the same trays would mean that no one in the dipping room would get the jaw again. This gap between what the workers knew in experience and what they did not know in technical specificity was maintained by the same absence of information flow that characterized the whole regulatory failure of the period. The knowledge that could have mattered most to the workers was held in places they could not reach. The physicians who had it were not required to share it with factory workers. The manufacturers who had it had every reason not to share it. The inspectors who reported it upward into the bureaucratic system were not reporting it across into the community of workers whose lives would have been changed by knowing it. The physicians wrote their papers, the reformers read them, the workers were sick and some were dying. The matchboxes sat on the shelves. Something else was needed to break the silence, and it was coming from an unexpected direction in the summer of a particular year. But before we follow the story into that summer, it is worth spending a moment with the quality of waiting that precedes it. The 1870s and 1880s, for those who are paying attention to the match industry and its hazards, had the character of a situation that is clearly wrong and clearly solvable, and is nonetheless not being solved. The physicians were writing, the reformers were reading, the workers were sick, the matchboxes were on the shelves. Thomas Oliver, whose epidemiological work in the 1880s was among the most rigorous and most comprehensive that had yet been produced on the subject, was not a man given to extravagant expression. His published papers on phosphorus necrosis are models of clinical restraint, careful and methodical, and almost ostentatiously unemotional in their tone. But in his private correspondence of the period, a different quality occasionally surfaces. There is a letter from the mid-1880s, preserved in a university archive, in which he writes to a colleague about the match industry investigation, in terms that reveal a frustration with the gap between what the evidence shows and what the regulatory bodies are prepared to do about it. He does not use dramatic language. He was not a man who used dramatic language. But the frustration is there in the precision with which he describes the resistance he is encountering from industrial interests and from the bureaucratic inertia of the inspectorate. The reformers who worked alongside Oliver had similar experiences. The social reform movement of the late Victorian period was characterized by a particular kind of productive outrage, an outrage that expressed itself through the accumulation of evidence and the careful construction of arguments and the patient engagement with parliamentary processes that moved slowly and resisted change and occasionally after much effort produced it. These were people who understood that reform took time and who were prepared to spend that time, and who nonetheless found the specific slowness of the phossy jaw campaign, the decades of documented harm and available remedy and continued inaction, difficult to accept with equanimity. The workers themselves had a different relationship to the waiting. For them, it was not abstract. It was their own bodies and the bodies of their workmates. The waiting meant more cases of the jaw in the rooms where they worked, more women dismissed when the disease progressed to the point of visibility, more names in the hospital records that were accumulating in the archives. They could see the harm and they could not stop it. And the waiting had the specific quality of helplessness that comes from being the people most affected by a situation over which you have the least control. And then, in the June of 1888, something changed. In the summer of 1888, the static condition of the argument broke open. Not through a new scientific discovery, not through a change in the law, not through the intervention of a government that had finally decided the evidence was sufficient. It broke open through the action of the workers themselves, and through the particular combination of circumstances that allowed their action to achieve what years of medical documentation and reforming advocacy had not. Bryant May was the dominant match manufacturer in England. Its factory complex in Bow employed approximately 1,400 workers, the great majority of them women and girls drawn from the dense working-class streets of Poplar, Stepney, Whitechapel, and Bow itself. The factory was known in the district in the particular way that a major local employer is known, as a fact of the landscape, as a presence in the economy, as the place where your neighbours worked and where you might find yourself working if circumstances required. The factory had been operating at the Bow site since the 1850s, growing steadily as the match trade grew and as Bryant and May consolidated their position in the English market through a combination of quality, marketing, and the kind of aggressive competitive strategy that the Victorian commercial environment rewarded and praised. The company had powerful shareholders, prominent directors, and a place in the financial and social life of the city that gave it a kind of respectability that its workers conspicuously did not share. The wages at Bryant and May were not the worst available in the East End, but they were not generous, and they were subject to a fine system that could reduce them significantly in any given week. Workers could be fined for being late, which was prosecuted rigorously, for having dirty feet observed at the gate, for talking during work hours, for dropping a match frame, for a range of minor infractions that in aggregate created a disciplinary environment designed to maximize production by minimizing any behavior that deviated from the required. The fine system was not unique to Bryant and May, but it was applied with an enthusiasm that workers found punishing, and the management's attitude toward worker concerns was generally characterized by the assumption that if you did not like the conditions, you were free to find employment elsewhere. The company was profitable and proud of its profitability. Its shareholders received dividends. Its directors received salaries. The product sold well. From the perspective of the people who ran it, Bryant and May was a successful enterprise doing what successful enterprises did, and the suggestion that this success was being partially subsidized by the health and lives of the workers in the dipping rooms was not a suggestion they found interesting or persuasive. In June of 1888, a journalist and social reformer named Annie Besant published an article in her paper, The Link, under the title White Slavery in London. Besant was not a naive journalist stumbling onto a story she had not expected to find. She was a committed and sophisticated reformer who understood exactly how the public communication of social conditions worked and what made the difference between a report that was read and forgotten and a report that produced consequences. She had spent years in radical politics and social reform movements, had been involved with trade unions and secularism and Fabian socialism, and had developed a sharp sense of which details of a situation were most likely to move the readers of a progressive weekly paper to the kind of engagement that might actually change something. The content of the article was a detailed account of conditions at Bryant and May, drawn from conversations with workers and from the public record of the factory inspection reports and medical studies that had been accumulating for decades. Besant described the wages. She described the fine system. She described the long working hours and the poor conditions in the factory, and she described phossy jaw. She described it not in the clinical language of medical reports but in the direct language of journalism, and the effect was different from the medical language in an important way. It was written to be read and felt by people who were not physicians, people who had no particular reason to be interested in the epidemiology of occupational jaw disease, but who were very capable of being moved by the account of a young woman glowing in the dark from a disease caused by conditions her employer had chosen not to change. The article produced exactly the response Besant intended. It was read widely, it generated discussion, it attracted attention to conditions that many readers had not previously known about, and it made Bryant and May's management very angry indeed. The management's response to the article was, in retrospect, one of the more significant own goals in Victorian industrial history. Rather than addressing the substance of Besant's account, they attempted to have the workers who had spoken to her identify themselves and sign a document repudiating her claims. They summoned workers to the manager's office and pressured them to sign a statement declaring the article false. The workers refused. 3 workers were dismissed, whether for having spoken to Besant or for refusing to sign the repudiation. The accounts differ somewhat on the precise sequence. What is clear is the effect. On the 5th of July 1888, 1,400 workers walked out of the Bryant and May factory and did not go back in. The strike that followed was, by the standards of Victorian industrial disputes, remarkable in several ways. The strikers were women and girls, the poorest and least organised workers in the East End, people who had no union, no strike fund, no access to the legal and institutional machinery that had developed to support industrial action in the male-dominated heavy industries. They had their wages, which had just stopped. They had each other. And they had, unexpectedly and crucially, public sympathy. Besant threw herself into organising support. She helped the strikers present their case to sympathetic journalists and reformers. The logistics of maintaining a strike among 1,400 workers who have no strike fund and no union infrastructure are, in practical terms, extremely demanding. The women of Bryant and May who walked out on the 5th of July did not have savings sufficient to sustain them through an indefinite work stoppage. They had weekly wages that were now not coming, and household obligations that did not stop because the wages had. Some of them had children. Some of them had sick relatives dependent on their earnings. Some of them had rent due in the first week of the month and no way to pay it if the strike extended that far. The strike fund that Besson established within days of the walkout was therefore not merely a gesture of solidarity, but a practical necessity for the continuation of the action. Without money coming in from somewhere, the strike would simply dissolve as individual workers, unable to sustain themselves without wages, return to the factory in ones and twos in the practical capitulation that poverty always threatens to produce. The contributions that arrived in response to Besant's appeals, from trade unions and sympathetic individuals and church organizations and progressive women's groups, were what stood between the strike and this dissolution. They were also, in themselves, evidence of the shift that Besant's article had produced in public awareness. The people who donated to the strike fund were people who had read about phossy jaw, in the terms Besant had used, who had encountered the specific detail of the glowing workers and the progressive bone destruction and the disease that the company had for decades declined to prevent, and who had responded to that specific detail with a specific willingness to act. They were people who understood, having read the article, that this was not simply a wage dispute in an ordinary factory, but a dispute about whether workers could be required to absorb preventable harm as a condition of employment. Besant threw herself into organising support. She helped the strikers present their case to sympathetic journalists and reformers. She collected strike funds. She helped draft the strikers' formal demands. The cause found advocates in parts of London society where it might not have expected to find them, in clergy, in progressive journalists, in women's organisations, in the nascent trade union movement that was in this same period beginning to organise among the unskilled workers who had previously been considered unorganisable. The public responded to the story with more warmth than Bryant and May's management had anticipated. There is a quality to the public response to the Matchgirl strike that is worth trying to understand, because it was not entirely predictable. Labour disputes in Victorian England were common enough, and the public response to them was not uniformly sympathetic, particularly when the workers involved were unskilled and the employers were established and respectable. The management of Bryant and May would have been justified, by the standards of the period, in expecting that their version of events, the lawful employer acting reasonably against unruly workers stirred up by outside agitators, would find an audience among the newspaper-reading public. That this was not the response they received is explained partly by Besant's skill and partly by the specific content of the case she had made. The fine system, and the phossy jaw, and the wages, and the management's response to her article all combined to produce a picture that was genuinely difficult to defend, and the management's attempt to defend it by coercing workers to sign a repudiation had made the picture worse rather than better. They had, in trying to suppress the story, confirmed its essential character. The donations to the strike fund came from an unusually wide range of sources, which itself tells you something about the public response. Trade unions contributed, as you would expect. But so did middle-class women's organisations, church congregations, and individuals who had no particular connection to the labour movement, but who had read Besant's article and found themselves unable to simply set it aside. The specific detail of phossy jaw, the disease that turned workers' faces luminescent in the dark, was the detail that travelled furthest and landed hardest, because it was specific enough to be visualised and compelling enough to be remembered, and because the combination of the physical strangeness and the preventability and the decades of inaction on the part of those who could have prevented it constituted a kind of moral indictment that resonated beyond the usual boundaries of labour sympathy. The public responded to the story with more warmth than Bryant and May's management had anticipated. The specific details of phossy jaw, the glowing workers, the progressive bone destruction, the disease that had been documented for 40 years without producing legislative action, carried a particular rhetorical force when connected to the faces and names and wages of 1,400 actual women, rather than the statistical tables of inspection reports. Donations arrived for the strike fund. Demonstrations of support occurred in various parts of London. Letters appeared in newspapers. The story, once told in the language of journalism rather than the language of medical reports, was not easily contained. Bryant and May held out for 2 weeks. On the 19th of July, 1888, the company capitulated on the central demands. The fine system was abolished. A separate room was established for eating, so that workers would no longer be consuming their food in proximity to the phosphorus trays. Workers were promised the right to raise grievances through elected representatives. The 3 dismissed workers, the immediate trigger of the strike, were reinstated. The settlement did not ban white phosphorus. It did not reform the chemistry of the dipping room. It did not eliminate phossy jaw. But it changed the atmosphere of the entire argument in ways that were not immediately visible, but were genuinely significant. The Match Girls' strike was a story. It was a story with faces and names and a clear enough narrative arc. The poor workers, the unreasonable employer, the brave walkout, the public support, the victory, to be told and retold and to carry, embedded in the retelling, the details of the underlying condition that had made the story possible. Every account of the strike that appeared in a newspaper or a pamphlet or a speech for the following decade carried with it some account of phossy jaw. The strike did not solve the problem, but it made the problem permanent news. It also demonstrated something practical about the power of organised industrial action among previously unorganised workers. In the months and years immediately following the Match Girls' strike, the organising drive among unskilled workers in London and other industrial cities accelerated noticeably. The dock workers' strike of 1889, one of the landmark events of the new unionism movement, was in part inspired by what the Match Girls had demonstrated was possible. And for the specific campaign against white phosphorus, the strike had established more powerfully than any medical paper or inspection report could, the human reality of the condition and the human cost of the industry's continued refusal to address it. The physicians had been saying this for 40 years. Now a very large number of people had heard it, not in the language of the medical journal, but in the language of news and story and visible human suffering. The factory in Bow reopened on the 20th of July. The workers returned through the same gate they had left through. The dipping room was the same dipping room. The phosphorus paste was the same paste. But something had shifted permanently in the relationship between what was known about that paste and what could be said about it in public without being dismissed or ignored. The Match Girls who returned to the factory on the 20th of July were not the same workers who had left it on the 5th. They had, in 2 weeks, done something that no worker in the match industry had managed before: organised themselves from nothing into a force sufficient to compel a major manufacturer to change its practices. They had done this without a union, without a strike fund, without legal support, without any of the institutional infrastructure that the established labour movement regarded as the minimum necessary for effective industrial action. They had done it with each other and with the public support that Besant's article and her continued advocacy had generated. The experience changed them, not in some vague, generalised sense, but in the specific practical sense that people who have discovered they can act collectively to change their situation are different from people who have not yet discovered this. The Match Girls of Bryant and May in August of 1888 knew something they had not known in June: that organised resistance was possible, that public sympathy was available if the case could be made clearly enough, that the employer's power was not absolute. They formed a union. The Matchmakers' Union, established in the wake of the strike, was among the earliest successful unions of unskilled women workers in England. It was not a powerful organisation by the standards of the established craft unions. It had limited funds and limited experience, and limited institutional knowledge of how to operate within the legal and organisational framework of the trade union movement. But it existed, and its existence meant that the workers of Bryant and May had a collective voice and a collective structure through which to pursue ongoing concerns. Among those concerns was phossy jaw. The union took up the question of the dipping room conditions with a directness and a persistence that the management had not experienced from its workforce before. Not with success immediately, not in the specific sense of achieving the change in chemistry that would have ended the disease, but with a sustained insistence that the issue was not going to be allowed to disappear from the conversation. The Match Girls' strike had begun as a protest about wages and fines. It had ended as something more than that, a moment in the public life of the reform campaign against white phosphorus, a moment that gave the campaign a human face and a story that could be told and retold that made the abstract argument of the inspection reports and the medical papers into something immediate and personal and impossible to entirely dismiss. The strike had demonstrated several things simultaneously, and each demonstration had a different significance for a different part of the audience that was watching. For the manufacturers, it demonstrated that the workforce they had assumed was passive and unorganizable was capable, under the right circumstances, of producing effective collective action. This was information they did not welcome but could not ignore. The comfortable assumption that the dipping room workers could be managed through the combination of wages and the fine system, and the implicit threat of dismissal, had been tested and found inadequate. The test had been costly and public, and the result of the test was now part of the record. It could not be repeated without even greater public attention and even greater public sympathy for the workers. For the trade union movement, the strike demonstrated the possibility of organising among the unskilled workers who had previously been considered outside the reach of union organisation. The craft unions of the mid-Victorian period had been built on the foundation of skilled workers whose specific expertise gave them a form of market power in disputes with employers. The unskilled workers, whose labour was more easily replaced, had been assumed to lack the leverage necessary for effective industrial action. The matchgirls had demonstrated that under the right conditions, unskilled workers could act collectively with decisive effect. The new unionism that grew rapidly in the years following the strike was partly an application of those lessons to other groups of previously unorganised workers, the dock workers and the gas workers and the textile operatives who followed the matchgirls' example and discovered, as the matchgirls had discovered, that organisation was possible and that it worked. For the physicians and reformers who had been working on the white phosphorus question, the strike was the breakthrough in public communication that they had not been able to achieve through the medical and parliamentary channels alone. The specific details of phossy jaw, which had been available in the medical literature for 40 years, had not reached anything like a mass audience until Besant's article made them accessible in a popular journalistic form, and the strike made them newsworthy on a continuing basis. The gap between what the medical community knew and what the public knew had begun to close, and the closing of that gap was part of what would eventually produce the political pressure sufficient to overcome the manufacturers' continued resistance. The strike had also changed the specific terms of the public debate about the match industry in a way that was lasting. Before the strike, the argument about white phosphorus had been conducted primarily in technical and regulatory language. Clinical descriptions, inspection reports, parliamentary questions, the formal currency of an expert policy discussion that reached a limited audience and produced limited public engagement. After the strike, the argument had a human story attached to it, a story with faces and names and wages and a specific injustice that could be described in plain language to anyone who read a newspaper, or listened to a sermon or heard the account second-hand from someone who had. This change in the terms of the argument was, in the long run, one of the most significant consequences of the strike. The manufacturers could respond to technical arguments with technical counter-arguments, and they had been doing so for decades with considerable effect. They could not respond to the story of 1,400 women walking out of a factory in July because their employer would not provide a clean room for them to eat their dinner away from the phosphorus trays. The asymmetry between the story and any possible counter-narrative was too great. The story was too clear, too specific, too human to be effectively argued against. The factory in Bow reopened. The phosphorus paste remained in the trays. The campaign continued. But the campaign was now different in character from what it had been before the 5th of July, and the difference was real and lasting. The years between the matchgirls' strike of 1888 and the final prohibition of white phosphorus matches in England in 1910 were 22 years of campaigning, committee work, parliamentary debate, international negotiation, and the steady accumulation of political will in the face of industrial resistance. It is a period that is less dramatic than the strike, less emotionally immediate than the individual stories of the workers, less scientifically interesting than the clinical discoveries of the 1840s. But it is the period in which the actual change happened, and understanding it requires attending to the specific mechanisms by which scientific and social knowledge is eventually translated into enforceable law. The post-strike momentum in England produced over the following decade a series of parliamentary inquiries and government investigations. There was a particular irony in the way the manufacturers engaged with these post-strike investigations. Having spent decades arguing that the disease was rare, its causes uncertain, and the available remedy commercially impractical, they now found themselves in the position of engaging with parliamentary committees that had been sensitised by the strike's public impact and that were less inclined to accept those arguments at face value. The committee members had read Besant's article, or articles like it. They had heard from workers and physicians whose testimony was specific and documented. They asked harder questions than the manufacturers had previously encountered in formal settings, and the answers the manufacturers gave were subjected to a scrutiny they had not previously had to withstand. The manufacturers were not without resources in these encounters. They retained legal representation, commissioned their own scientific reports, and continued to advance the competitive disadvantage argument with persistence and some ingenuity. They were not simply rolled over. The process was a genuine contest, conducted over years and through multiple formal proceedings, in which the manufacturers' interests were vigorously represented. But the ground had shifted after the strike. The public attention that the strike had generated, and that the subsequent journalism and advocacy had maintained, meant that the match industry was no longer a matter of specialist industrial or medical interest. It was a public issue, regularly appearing in newspapers and periodicals that reached far beyond the audiences who had previously engaged with the factory inspection reports and the medical literature. The manufacturers were defending their position in a much larger arena than they had previously occupied, before an audience that was less deferential to commercial arguments and more responsive to the human dimensions of the story. The post-strike momentum in England produced over the following decade a series of parliamentary inquiries and government investigations that returned again and again to the question of the match industry and white phosphorus. The Dangerous Trades Committee of the 1890s worked its way through the evidence with the thoroughness that parliamentary investigative committees can muster when they are operating in good faith, and on the match industry question they were operating in good faith. Their reports were detailed, their conclusions were clear, and their recommendations were unambiguous. The recommendations were not immediately implemented. Parliament in the 1890s was not a body naturally disposed toward aggressive industrial regulation. The arguments about freedom of contract had not entirely lost their force, though they were weaker than they had been 20 years earlier. The match manufacturers continued to argue that the transition to safer chemistry would make their product less competitive against imports, that the cost would fall on the workers in the form of lower wages, that the disease affected a smaller proportion of workers than the reports suggested, that the reports were exaggerated, that the evidence was incomplete. These arguments were not offered in good faith. The manufacturers knew the evidence. They knew the disease was real and preventable. They knew the safety match chemistry worked. They were arguing against implementation because implementation would cost them money, and the arguments they were making were the arguments that seemed most likely to delay implementation, rather than the arguments that most accurately represented the facts of the situation. But delay was achieved for a time, and during the delay more workers became sick and some of them died, and the records of the London hospital and its counterparts in Manchester and Birmingham continued to accumulate the clinical documentation of a harm that was being continued by deliberate choice. The route that eventually worked was not purely domestic, it was international. Before arriving at that international route, it is worth noting what the domestic route had achieved, because the years between the strike and the convention were not entirely without progress. They were years in which the match industry's resistance to reform was gradually worn down by the combination of continuous parliamentary pressure, continued public advocacy, and the accumulated weight of a medical and scientific record that had become, by the early years of the 20th century, simply overwhelming in its consistency and its clarity. The manufacturers who appeared before parliamentary committees in the 1890s were in a different position from the manufacturers who had faced similar questions in the 1860s. In the 1860s, the evidence was relatively new, the clinical literature was smaller, and the questions were easier to deflect with arguments about the incompleteness of the record. By the 1890s, the record had been building for 50 years. The convergent testimony of physicians in 5 countries, the comparison with Denmark's successful prohibition, the specific epidemiological work of Thomas Oliver and his contemporaries had produced a body of evidence that no informed person could honestly characterize as insufficient. The manufacturers who continued to argue against prohibition in the 1890s were not arguing from evidence. They were arguing from interest, and increasingly they were being seen to be arguing from interest by parliamentary committees and by the press and by sections of the public who had followed the match industry question closely enough to understand the difference between the two. This shift in the perceived character of their resistance was itself a form of progress, even if it didn't immediately produce legislation. The manufacturers had also, by the 1890s, largely conceded the scientific question in private. The internal correspondence of some of the major English match companies, where it survives, shows that the executives of these companies understood by the late 1880s that white phosphorus caused phossy jaw and that safer alternatives were commercially viable. The public arguments they continued to make against prohibition were not arguments they believed in private. They were arguments designed to delay a transition they knew was coming while they maximised the remaining profitable life of the existing chemistry. The route that eventually worked was not purely domestic, it was international. In the first years of the 20th century, reformers in England, France, and several other countries began to pursue the goal of a multilateral treaty banning white phosphorus matches at the international level. The logic was straightforward. The chief argument against unilateral prohibition in any single country was the competitive disadvantage it would create for domestic manufacturers relative to importers still using the cheaper white phosphorus chemistry. An international agreement that applied equally to all signatories would remove this argument entirely. The Berne Convention of 1906 was the result. Negotiated among the industrial nations of Europe, it banned the manufacture, import and export of white phosphorus matches among the signatories, with a transitional period for implementation. It was one of the earlier examples of a multilateral agreement specifically directed at an occupational and public health hazard, and it represented a significant moment in the development of international approaches to industrial regulation. England prohibited the manufacture of white phosphorus matches in 1910, implementing the convention. The last white phosphorus match factory in England closed its dipping room and switched to safety match chemistry, and the specific exposure that had produced phossy jaw cases in English workers for 70 years came to an end. The transition, when it came, was managed with a practical competence that contrasted sharply with the decades of argument about whether it was possible. The manufacturers who had insisted for 30 years that the chemistry change was commercially catastrophic found, when they actually made the change, that it was commercially manageable. The safety match chemistry produced a match that performed adequately, that consumers accepted, that could be manufactured at a cost that allowed the industry to remain profitable. The predictions of doom were not borne out. The workers in the factories noticed the change most directly. The new paste was different in its physical properties, different in its smell, different in the way it behaved on the trays and frames and drying racks. It required some adjustment in technique. There were a few months of what a more recent management literature would call a learning curve, the period of adjustment in which the workers and the foreman and the production managers worked out the modifications necessary to achieve the same output quality with the new materials. And then the adjustment was made, and the work continued, and the dipping rooms were rooms with different paste in the trays, and the workers breathed air that still smelled of industrial chemistry, but not of the specific chemistry that had destroyed the bones of their predecessors, and the months passed, and the years passed, and the jaw disease for which the older workers still had names, even as the young ones were growing up without knowing what those names referred to, did not appear in the new workforce. England prohibited the manufacture of white phosphorus matches in 1910, implementing the convention. The last white phosphorus match factory in England closed its dipping room and switched to safety match chemistry, and the specific exposure that had produced phossy jaw cases in English workers for 70 years came to an end. The response in the United States followed a different path, characterized by the particular features of the American industrial and political landscape. The match industry in America was dominated by the Diamond Match Company, which controlled a large proportion of the domestic market through a combination of patents, acquisitions, and vertical integration. The company had been making white phosphorus matches for decades, and was aware of the disease for the same reasons that every match manufacturer in every country was aware of it by the late 19th century. The American advocacy against white phosphorus matches was shaped significantly by Alice Hamilton, a physician and reformer who was in the early years of the 20th century conducting the most systematic investigation of industrial disease in the United States that had yet been attempted. Hamilton's approach was characteristically direct. She went to the factories, examined the workers, reviewed the records, and produced documentation of conditions that was difficult to dispute because it was based on personal observation of specific individuals in specific workplaces. Her work on the match industry confirmed what the European evidence had established 40 years earlier and extended it with the characteristic rigour of an observer who was not content to cite the existing literature but needed to see the conditions herself. Her reports were influential in generating the political pressure that eventually produced American legislation. The path from the strike of 1888 to the Prohibition of 1910 moved through a series of formal institutions in a sequence that was necessary but not sufficient at any individual step. Each institution contributed something, and the contribution of each was real, but none of them alone was capable of producing the outcome. The parliamentary committees provided the formal record, the documented acknowledgement by a legislative body that the evidence was before it and the recommendations had been made. This mattered because it created accountability. Once a parliamentary committee had recommended action, the question of why action had not been taken was answerable in documented form, and the answer did not reflect well on those responsible for the inaction. The trade union movement, building on the precedent of the match girls' strike, provided the organised worker presence in the political process that had been absent before. The matchmakers' union was small and not powerful, but the broader new unionism that the match girls had helped inspire was growing, and the growing labour movement was beginning to generate political representation that could translate worker interests into parliamentary pressure. The press provided the public awareness that kept the issue from returning to the technical obscurity in which it had existed for most of its history. The reports, the articles, the occasional feature journalism that returned to the match industry question in the years after the strike maintained a level of public attention that made the issue harder to set aside than it had been in the years when only physicians and factory inspectors were paying attention to it. And the international movement provided eventually the structural solution to the competitive argument that had blocked domestic action. The Berne Convention was not achieved quickly or easily. The negotiations were protracted and the concessions required were real. But when the convention was achieved, the argument that had stymied prohibition for decades simply ceased to apply. The Diamond Match Company, facing increasing political pressure and the prospect of legislation, made a decision in 1911 that was notable both for what it represented and for the commercial calculation it contained. The company had developed a successful formulation using sesquisulfide of phosphorus as an alternative to white phosphorus, producing a match that performed well commercially while eliminating the toxic exposure. It donated this patent to the public domain, allowing all manufacturers to use the chemistry without paying royalty fees. The donation was presented as an act of corporate public spiritedness, and it was received as such. It was also a commercially astute move by a company that could see which way the legislative wind was blowing and wanted to shape the transition to its advantage. The White Phosphorus Match Act became law in the United States in 1912, imposing a prohibitive tax on white phosphorus matches that made their continued production commercially non-viable. Within a few years of prohibition in England and the United States, the evidence from clinical records was clear. The clean records were not just an absence of new cases, they were also the final, definitive, impossible to dispute confirmation of everything that the medical literature of the previous 70 years had argued. The relationship between white phosphorus exposure and phossy jaw had been stated clearly, demonstrated repeatedly, and argued against by manufacturers and their representatives with a persistence that had succeeded in delaying action for far longer than the evidence warranted. After prohibition, the argument was over, not because the manufacturers had conceded it, but because the factory records and the clinical records simply showed what they showed. Workers who had never been exposed to white phosphorus in the dipping room did not develop phosphorus necrosis of the jaw. The correlation between exposure and disease that the early clinicians had described was now being demonstrated in its inverse, by the correlation between the absence of exposure and the absence of disease. The post-prohibition period also produced a small body of retrospective clinical work that documented the final legacy cases, the workers who had been exposed before the prohibition and who developed the disease in the years following it, as the accumulated exposure of previous years finally manifested in clinical presentation. These cases were fewer in number than the pre-prohibition cases, but they were no less serious in their individual manifestation, and they were treated with the greater clinical resources available in the early 20th century, including a more systematic understanding of the condition and its management, than had existed in the 1850s or 1860s. The last of these legacy cases, the late manifestation of pre-prohibition exposure, occurred in the 1920s. After that, the clinical literature fell silent on the subject of occupational phosphorus necrosis of the jaw, not because the literature stopped being published, but because there was nothing new to report. The disease that had been regular, documented, and unremedied for 8 decades had ceased to have new cases to describe. Within a few years of prohibition in England and the United States, the evidence from clinical records was clear. The disease that had been a regular presence in the occupational health records of every industrial nation for 3/4 of a century was disappearing. New cases had essentially ceased to appear. Workers who had been in the dipping rooms before prohibition and who had not yet developed the disease were not developing it. The accumulation of harm, which had continued uninterrupted for 7 decades, had stopped. That fact, the cessation of new cases after prohibition, provided the most powerful retrospective confirmation of everything that the medical writers of the 1840s had argued, and that the industrial and political systems of the 19th century had spent so long declining to act upon. The disease stopped when the exposure stopped, exactly as had always been predicted. The remedy that had been available since 1845 had, when finally applied, worked exactly as advertised. 1910 in England. 1912 in America. France followed within a few years. The dates differ by country, as the international framework required each signatory to implement prohibition on its own schedule. But the direction was the same everywhere, and the effect was the same everywhere. The dipping rooms were cleaned of white phosphorus. The alternative chemistry was installed. The factories continued producing matches. The workers continued working, and phossy jaw did not appear in the new workforce. The speed with which the disease disappeared after prohibition was, to those who had spent years arguing for the change, both gratifying and bittersweet. Gratifying because it confirmed in the most direct and unambiguous way everything that the physicians and reformers had been arguing for decades. Bittersweet because the speed of the disappearance demonstrated, equally directly and equally unambiguously, how quickly the disease could have been eliminated had the prohibition come earlier. If the prohibition had come in 1874, when Denmark first demonstrated its viability, the workers who developed phossy jaw in the following 36 years would not have developed it. The cases that accumulated in the hospital records between Denmark's prohibition and England's, and then between England's prohibition and America's, were cases that did not have to happen. They happened because the remedy was available, and the political will to implement it was not. This is the part of the history that is hardest to sit with comfortably. Not the delay of the initial years when the disease was still being understood and the evidence was still being assembled. The delay after the evidence was assembled. The delay after Denmark demonstrated that the prohibition was commercially viable without the catastrophic competitive consequences the manufacturers had predicted. The delay after the dangerous Trades Committee reports, which documented the harm and the remedy with a thoroughness that left no room for reasonable doubt. Those years of delay are documented. The workers who were harmed during them are, many of them, documented too, their names in hospital records and inspection reports, and reformers' notebooks and parliamentary testimony. They are not anonymous. They had names and ages and addresses and families and specific clinical presentations that specific physicians noted in specific records that are preserved in specific archives. The match finally changed. The workers who came into the clean dipping rooms after prohibition breathed air that did not carry the specific harm that their predecessors had breathed. They went home without the phosphorus in their bones. Their jaws did not swell. They did not wake in the dark to see themselves glowing. This is the ending of the story that took far too long to arrive. It arrived. That is real and it matters. And the time it took to arrive is also real and also matters, and neither of those facts displaces the other. The history of phossy jaw is not only an English story, or an American story. It is, in a deeply real sense, an industrial story, belonging to every country where the match factory went, and where the white phosphorus paste was used, and where the workers breathed the vapour in the dipping rooms without adequate protection, and without adequate information about what they were breathing and what it was doing to them. Before examining the French case in detail, it is worth stepping back to consider the global geography of the match industry in the 19th century. because the disease did not map cleanly onto national boundaries in the way that national histories of prohibition might suggest. White phosphorus matches were made wherever there was a market for matches and a sufficient concentration of chemical and manufacturing expertise to establish the production. In the European heartland, this meant England, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the smaller industrial nations of the Low Countries and Scandinavia. But the spread of the industrial model throughout the 19th century meant that the match industry followed European capital and European technology into Asia, into Latin America, and into the various territories of the colonial world. Japan established a domestic match industry in the Meiji period, in the 1870s and 1880s, as part of the broader industrialization program that the Meiji government pursued with remarkable speed and deliberateness. The early Japanese match factories used white phosphorus chemistry, imported or adapted from European sources, and the workers in those factories were subject to the same exposure as their European counterparts. Japanese medical literature of the late 19th century contains accounts of what was clearly phossy jaw, described in clinical terms that parallel the European literature, documented by physicians who were operating within the tradition of Western medicine that the Meiji period had adopted alongside Western industrial technology. In India, match production developed partly within the colonial economic framework, and partly through the establishment of domestic enterprises in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The condition of workers in these factories was subject to less systematic documentation than in Europe, partly because the regulatory and medical infrastructure for such documentation was less developed, and partly because the colonial context shaped both what was investigated and what was reported in ways that disadvantaged the documentation of harm to colonial workers. The global geography of white phosphorus match production is therefore a geography of harm that extends well beyond the boundaries of the European industrial heartland in which it is usually discussed. The total number of workers harmed by phossy jaw across all countries and all decades of white phosphorus match production is not known and cannot be calculated with any precision. But it was certainly substantially larger than the European figures that form the core of the documented history. France is worth examining at some length, partly because of the structural peculiarity of the French situation, and partly because the French experience illuminates, in a particularly clear way, the relationship between economic interest and regulatory failure. The French match industry in the 19th century was, as noted earlier, a state monopoly. This meant that the Régie Française des Allumettes, the state match authority, held the exclusive right to manufacture and sell matches in France, generating revenue for the French treasury and employment for French workers in the factories distributed across the country. The managers of the Régie were civil servants. The revenue from match sales flowed to the government, and the government was simultaneously the regulator of the industry and its owner, the body responsible for ensuring safe working conditions and the body responsible for maximising the profitability of the enterprise. This was a structural conflict of interest of the clearest possible kind, and it produced exactly the outcome that structural conflicts of interest predictably produce. The regulatory oversight of the match factories was conducted by the same bureaucratic apparatus that had an interest in the continued profitability of those factories. When the evidence of phossy jaw cases in French matchworkers accumulated, the institutional response was shaped by the competing pull of that interest. Investigations were conducted, reports were written, findings were documented, and the chemistry did not change for a very long time. The French workers who developed phossy jaw in the second half of the 19th century were in a particularly difficult position, because the entity responsible for their harm was also the entity that employed them, and the entity that controlled the regulatory apparatus through which accountability would normally have been sought. The medical profession in France was independent of the Régie, and French physicians described and documented the disease with the same care that their counterparts in other countries showed. But the institutional path from documented harm to implemented remedy was longer and more obstructed in France precisely because of that ownership structure. Germany presents a somewhat different picture. The German match industry was not a state monopoly but a collection of private manufacturers operating in the various states and principalities, and then, after 1871, the unified German Empire. German industrial regulation was in some respects more interventionist than the English regulatory framework of the same period, and German medical science was at the end of the 19th century among the most productive in the world. The combination produced a somewhat shorter lag between medical documentation and regulatory action than was achieved in England, though the German prohibition still came years after it could have been implemented had the industry not continued to contest it. The story of how the Berne Convention came to be negotiated is itself a small history of international public health diplomacy in its formative period. The individuals who drove the international campaign were, for the most part, not the same people who had driven the domestic campaigns in their respective countries, though there was significant overlap in the networks through which information and advocacy travelled. They were a mixture of medical scientists who had followed the phossy jaw evidence across national borders, diplomats and civil servants who had been persuaded that the international competitive argument could only be resolved internationally, and reformers and trade unionists who had connections in multiple countries and could serve as conduits between the national campaigns. The negotiation of the convention took place against the background of a broader movement for international regulatory cooperation that was developing in the early 20th century across several domains simultaneously. The conventions on labour standards being developed under the auspices of various international organisations in this period were early expressions of a principle that would eventually become much more systematically embodied in the institutions of the post-World War II international order, that certain standards of worker protection and public health were matters of international as well as national concern, and that international agreements could serve to raise those standards in ways that individual national governments, constrained by competitive pressures, could not easily do alone. The Berne Convention on the prohibition of white phosphorus matches was, in this context, a small but real contribution to the development of international public health governance. It demonstrated that an international agreement on an industrial hazard was achievable, that the competitive argument could be resolved through multilateral commitment, and that the result was commercially viable for all parties. These demonstrations mattered for subsequent efforts in similar domains. Scandinavia deserves particular attention because it contains the most important single piece of comparative evidence in the whole story of white phosphorus. Denmark prohibited white phosphorus matches in 1874, decades before any other industrial nation, following a particularly active campaign by Danish physicians and reformers who made the most of the comparatively small and well-documented Danish match industry. After 1874, phossy jaw essentially ceased to appear among Danish matchworkers. The Danish evidence was therefore available to any country that wished to examine it from the mid-1870s onward. Here is a country that made white phosphorus matches for a number of years and had phossy jaw cases. Here is the prohibition. Here is the period afterward with no new cases. The evidence for both the reality of the harm and the effectiveness of the remedy was compressed into a small, well-documented, easily cited national experience. And yet the countries with larger match industries, England and France and Germany and eventually the United States, did not follow Denmark's lead for decades. The Danish workers who benefited from the 1874 prohibition were, in a sense, the first match workers in the world to be protected. Their experience after the prohibition is worth considering, because it provides the clearest possible evidence of what prohibition meant in practice for the people it protected. In the Danish factories that made the transition to safe chemistry in 1874 and the years immediately following, the workforce included workers who had been in the white phosphorus dipping rooms for varying lengths of time. Some of them had already developed the disease in its early stages. For those workers, the protection came too late in the specific sense that the harm was already begun. But the stopping of the exposure meant, for those in the early stages, that the progression could be halted, that the disease did not advance to the severe and disfiguring stages it reached when exposure continued uninterrupted for years. The clinical records of the Danish hospitals in the years after Prohibition show a pattern consistent with this. No new cases appearing in new workers, and the existing cases not progressing as severely as comparable cases in countries that had not yet made the change. For the younger workers who entered the Danish factories after 1874, the protection was complete. They worked in the dipping rooms without developing the disease. They worked alongside older colleagues who carried the early signs of the pre-prohibition exposure and who did not progress to the later stages. They lived their working lives in a factory that was measurably, demonstrably, clinically safer than the factory their predecessors had worked in. This was the Danish example, sitting in the medical and regulatory literature of Europe from 1874 onward, available to any country that chose to look at it. It showed, concretely and specifically, what the prohibition did and what it did not do, what it prevented and what it was too late to undo. It was evidence of the best possible quality, a natural experiment conducted on a national scale, with a clear before and after and a documented outcome. And yet the countries with larger match industries, England and France and Germany and eventually the United States, did not follow Denmark's lead for decades. The Danish example was cited repeatedly in the reform literature. Its implications were clear to anyone who read it. The smaller scale of the Danish industry, the argument went, made the transition less economically disruptive than it would be in England or France. This argument was not entirely without substance, but it was used to delay action far longer than it justified. The Swedish contribution to the story is somewhat different in character. It was a Swedish manufacturer, Johan Edvard Lundström, who developed the safety match in 1854, creating the design in which the striking surface is applied to the box rather than the match head, allowing the use of red phosphorus in the striking surface and a non-toxic match head formulation. The safety match, in its Swedish form, was both commercially viable and chemically safe. It was available from 1854. The gap between the availability of the safe alternative and the eventual prohibition of the dangerous one spanned more than half a century. The American experience extended into the 20th century, and it had features that differed from the European pattern in ways worth noting. The United States was by the end of the 19th century one of the world's largest match markets, and the diamond match company's dominance of that market gave it both the economic resources and the political influence to delay prohibition longer than had been the case in most European countries. The scale of the American industry was also larger, which meant that the number of workers potentially affected by any regulatory change was greater, and the economic interests arrayed against such change were correspondingly more substantial. Alice Hamilton's investigations in the early years of the 20th century were significant not only for their immediate contribution to the campaign against white phosphorus, but for what they represented methodologically. Hamilton was developing, largely through her own practice, the methods of what would become occupational medicine as a formal discipline, the systematic investigation of the relationship between workplace conditions and worker health, conducted through direct observation, clinical examination, and careful record-keeping. Her work on the match industry was part of a larger body of work on industrial hazards that would eventually produce both the academic field and the regulatory framework of occupational health in America. The international dimension of the eventual solution, the Berne Convention, and the series of national prohibitions that followed it, is worth reflecting upon as a moment of significance in the longer history of how industrial harm is governed. The argument that had stymied domestic prohibition in every individual country for decades was an argument that applied with equal force to every country that raised it. The solution was therefore inherently multilateral. The argument dissolved only when the prohibition applied simultaneously to all the relevant parties. The convention was not the first international agreement on a matter that we would today describe as a public health concern, but it was among the earlier ones, and it is a recognizable ancestor of the forms of international regulatory cooperation that became more common in the 20th century. The principle that some industrial hazards could not be effectively regulated by individual national governments acting alone, and therefore required multilateral mechanisms, was being established in the early 20th century through examples like this one. And gradually, country by country, through the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the white phosphorus match disappeared from the world's markets. The dipping rooms were cleared, the safer chemistry replaced the dangerous one. The disease that had been a documented occupational hazard of the match trade for 3/4 of a century ceased to produce new cases. The last documented case of occupational phosphorus necrosis of the jaw, arising from match factory work in an industrial country, was recorded in the 1920s. The phrase, "in an industrial country," carries a qualification that deserves attention. The match industry was not confined to Europe and North America. As the 19th century progressed and then turned into the 20th, the production of matches spread into Asia, into South America, into parts of Africa, carried by the same commercial logic that had driven its expansion in Europe. The product was in demand, the technology was accessible, the labour was available, the profit was possible. In India, in Japan, in Brazil, in various parts of the colonial world, match factories using white phosphorus were established during the same period in which the European and American manufacturers were being pushed toward prohibition. The workers in those factories breathed the same vapour in the same dipping rooms and were subject to the same harm as their counterparts in London and Lyon and Chicago. The clinical documentation of phossy jaw in non-European match workers was less systematic than in Europe, partly because the medical infrastructure for such documentation was less developed, partly because colonial and post-colonial record-keeping did not prioritise the occupational health of industrial workers in the same way that the European reform movement had pushed for. This means that the full global count of workers harmed by white phosphorus match production is not known and cannot be reconstructed with any precision. The European and American cases are documented in enough detail to support quantitative estimates, imprecise but meaningful. The cases in Asia and South America and elsewhere are much harder to count. The harm was real. The exposure was the same. The disease was the same, but the documentation is thinner, the records less complete, and the names in those records, where they exist at all, are names that most histories of phossy jaw do not include. The Berne Convention and the subsequent national prohibitions in Europe and America were not immediately extended with equal force to colonial territories and to independent countries outside the Western industrialized world. The transition to safe match chemistry in those parts of the world came later, in some cases much later, and came through a combination of the international standardization of chemistry that made safe matches the default commercial product globally, the regulatory development of newly independent states, and the general commercial logic that made safety match chemistry the more viable option as the 20th century progressed. The last documented case of occupational phosphorus necrosis of the jaw, arising from match factory work in an industrial country, was recorded in the 1920s. By then, the factories had been cleaned for years in most places. The case was a legacy, the late manifestation of an exposure that had begun before Prohibition, and whose effects had taken years to become clinically apparent. After that, the records are silent. The disease, which had been a regular presence in the occupational health literature of 5 continents for 80 years, was gone. The disappearance was not celebrated with any particular ceremony. There was no proclamation, no formal acknowledgement that a harm which had been present for 80 years had ceased to exist. The medical journals recorded the declining case numbers in the same clinical language in which they had recorded the rising ones, without drama, without retrospective commentary on what the numbers meant in human terms. The factories that had made the transition were, after a few years, simply factories that made matches. The dipping rooms were rooms where different chemistry was used. The workers were workers who did not develop a particular disease. The absence of drama in the ending is in its own way revealing. The industries that had resisted prohibition had argued that the costs of change would be catastrophic. They were not catastrophic. The transition was made. The matches continued to be made. The consumers continued to buy them. The end of white phosphorus in the match industry was, commercially and industrially, essentially uneventful. The harm that had been sustained for 8 decades to avoid this uneventful transition was therefore not a necessary cost of the industry's viability. It was a cost that had been imposed on workers to protect the convenience and the margins of manufacturers, and it had been imposed for far longer than necessity required. Alice Hamilton continued working after the prohibition of white phosphorus matches. The match campaign had been one of her early investigations, and it had been a formative experience in the development of her methods and her approach to industrial medicine. She spent the following decades investigating other industrial hazards: lead poisoning in the smelting and painting industries, radium exposure among watch dial painters, carbon monoxide in steel production, the long list of substances and conditions that industrial labour brought workers into contact with, and that caused harm that went undocumented and unremedied, until someone like Hamilton went into the factories and looked at what was happening. The pattern she had encountered in the match industry, knowledge existing and being available while harm continued for want of political will to act on it, was a pattern she would encounter again and again in the industries she investigated. The match campaign had not solved that pattern. It had provided one case in which the pattern had eventually been broken, one demonstration that the translation from knowledge to action was possible even when resisted, one precedent for what could be achieved when the scientific evidence, the public advocacy, the worker organisation, and the international coordination all came together in sufficient force. That precedent mattered, not because it was always cited or always remembered in subsequent campaigns, but because it was there, in the historical record as proof that such campaigns could succeed. The phossy jaw campaign left a legacy in 3 distinct domains that are worth distinguishing. The first is the most obvious. The specific harm was ended. The disease ceased to appear in the workers who made the matches. The daily lives of the people who worked in the match factories after 1910 were different in a specific and important way from the daily lives of their predecessors, and the difference was the direct result of the campaign. This is the legacy that mattered most to the workers themselves. The second legacy is methodological. The phossy jaw campaign helped establish the practice of occupational medicine as a serious discipline with recognised methods and recognised importance. The work of Thomas Oliver in England and Alice Hamilton in America in documenting the disease and demonstrating its preventability drew on methods that were new in the context of industrial medicine, methods that combined clinical observation with epidemiological analysis, with workplace investigation, and that required a practitioner who was willing to go into the factory rather than simply receiving patients in a consulting room. These methods were developed and refined through the match industry work and then applied to the investigation of other industrial hazards, creating the intellectual foundations of a discipline that now exists in every industrialized country in the world. The third legacy is institutional and political. The match industry campaign was part of the longer process by which the regulatory framework for industrial health and safety was expanded and strengthened in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Each successful campaign against a specific industrial hazard added to the body of precedent and practice that made subsequent campaigns easier to advance. The argument that a manufacturer could not be required to change a process that harmed workers became harder to sustain after phossy jaw was prohibited, because the prohibition demonstrated that such requirements were legally possible, commercially viable, and politically achievable. The precedent was cumulative. Each case that was won made the next case slightly easier to win. That precedent mattered, not because it was always cited or always remembered in subsequent campaigns, but because it was there, in the historical record, as proof that such campaigns could succeed. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles after the end of a long story. Not the quiet of incompleteness, not the quiet of something left unresolved, but the quiet of a thing that has been fully told and can now rest in the space where telling and silence meet. This story has reached that kind of quiet. The prohibition was implemented. The disease ceased to appear in the workers who made the matches. The machinery of harm, which had operated for 8 decades across 5 continents, in the dipping rooms of the match industry was dismantled and replaced with machinery that did not harm in that particular way. It is worth staying with the shape of what happened for a moment before moving on. The history of phossy jaw is, at its structural core, a history of a gap. But it is also, before it is a history of a gap, a history of ordinary people doing ordinary things under extraordinary circumstances. The workers who went to the match factory in the 1860s and 1870s and 1880s were not going to make history. They were going to earn their living. They were going to do what the day required and come home and do what the evening required and sleep and get up and do it again. The match factory was the circumstance they had been given by the specific accident of birth and class and geography that determined what a person's working options were in the East End of London in the second half of the 19th century. They did not choose the phosphorus. The phosphorus was in the room when they got there, part of the job as it had been defined before they arrived, part of the industrial landscape that was simply given rather than selected. They could leave and find other work, if other work was available, and the wages were sufficient to sustain their households. Some did leave. The ones who stayed were the ones for whom the match factory wages represented the best available option, a description that carries within it the entire compressed history of Victorian working-class poverty and the limited range of choices it permitted. The history of phossy jaw is, at its structural core, a history of a gap between knowing and doing, between documented harm and implemented remedy. Between the publication of Lawrence's clinical description in 1845 and the implementation of the first national prohibition in Denmark in 1874, there were 29 years. Between that first prohibition and the English prohibition in 1910, there were 36 more. Between the original description of the disease and its complete elimination from the world's match factories, there was something approaching 80 years. What filled that gap was not ignorance. The ignorance of phossy jaw lasted perhaps a decade, from the beginning of white phosphorus match production in the early 1830s until the medical descriptions of the early 1840s. After that point, the disease was described, documented, and understood. The gap was not filled with ignorance. It was filled with the particular combination of economic interest, regulatory inadequacy, and structural indifference that characterizes the relationship between industrial profit and worker welfare throughout the history of industrial capitalism. This is not a comfortable conclusion to draw. It is, however, the conclusion that the evidence supports, and the evidence is quite good. And yet there is something else in this history that deserves equal weight, not to balance the discomfort, not to render the indifference more acceptable by comparison, but because it is true, and because the truth of it matters for how we understand what the history of phossy jaw finally means. The people who ended it existed. They are real historical figures whose names we know and whose work we can document. Lorenza, who wrote the first clinical description and said clearly that white phosphorus was the cause and the exposure the remedy. Thomas Oliver, who spent years building the epidemiological case and refused to stop making it even when it was being ignored. Alice Hamilton, who went into the American factories and documented what she found with the particular force of direct observation. Annie Besant, who wrote the article that connected the medical evidence to the public imagination in the summer of 1888. The reformers who pushed for the Dangerous Trades Committee reports in the 1890s. The diplomats and administrators who negotiated the Berne Convention in 1906. The legislators in England and America and France and a dozen other countries who finally voted for prohibition. And the workers themselves, the 1,400 women of Bryant and May who walked out of the factory gate on the 5th of July 1888 and did not go back in until the conditions changed. The individual workers whose testimony provided the human evidence behind the clinical statistics. The women who talked to Besant and to the inspectors and to the hospital physicians, knowing that their testimony was a record of what was being done to them and offering it anyway. All of these people acted. They acted against various degrees of resistance, and they acted at various points across a very long timeline. The action was slow, it was often frustrated, it was achieved against determined opposition from well-resourced interests that had strong reasons to prefer inaction, but it was achieved. That is what the history of phossy jaw finally looks like, if you step back far enough to see its full shape. A harm was created, a harm was documented, the documentation was contested and ignored for a long time. People kept working, kept documenting, kept arguing, kept organising, the harm was ended. The ending was too slow. The workers who were harmed between 1845 and 1910 were harmed by a preventable disease, and the preventability was documented throughout that entire period. They deserved better than they received. The distance between what was known and what was done is a genuine moral failure of the industrial systems of the 19th century, and nothing in the eventual success of the campaign erases it. But the success of the campaign is also real, and in a world in which many campaigns for justice against industrial harm have not yet succeeded, there is a particular kind of meaning in a story where they did. Consider what it means to hold these two things at once, the grief and the hope, the failure and the achievement, the unacceptable delay and the eventual ending. This is perhaps the most honest way to hold any history of reform. The delay was wrong, the ending was right. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and neither cancels the other. The match industry continued after Prohibition. The safety match, using the safer chemistry that had been available since 1854, turned out to work perfectly well for the purpose of making fire available to ordinary people quickly and cheaply. The transition that the industry had argued for decades would be commercially catastrophic turned out to be commercially straightforward. The matches continued to sell, the workers continued to work, the factories continued to produce. The dipping rooms still exist, in the sense that the process of applying the striking compound to the match head still requires rooms and workers and trays and frames, but the trays contain different chemistry, and the workers in them breathe air that does not carry the specific vapour that destroyed the bones of their predecessors. The process is recognisably the same process. The harm is not there. That absence, the absence of a harm that was once present, is invisible. You cannot see the absence of phossy jaw in the modern matchworker's face the way you could see its presence in the glow of the affected jaw in a dark Victorian room. The absence is not marked or commemorated. The small box on the kitchen shelf does not carry any record of the campaign that made it safe. But the history is there, in the archives where Lawrence's papers are preserved, in the hospital records where Sarah's name is written, in the transcript of the parliamentary inquiry that the Match Girls' representatives attended in August of 1888, in the text of the Berne Convention, in the published works of Thomas Oliver and Alice Hamilton. There is a kind of permanence in the documentary record that is very different from the permanence of memory or of monuments, but is real in its own way. The record says, this happened. This was done to these people. These people resisted and argued and organised and eventually changed it. The match factory was made clean. The workers were protected. The disease stopped. You are carried now, gently, on the current of this long story toward its ending. Let the weight of it settle into the surface beneath you, that familiar weight of having sat with something real, something that mattered, something that you did not know before tonight. Let the images drift and slow. The narrow street in the East End of London, the women at the factory gate, their shawls pulled against the November cold, the dipping room lit with gas lamps, the trays of pale paste, the hands moving steadily through the hours, the pale glow barely visible on the faces of those who have been there long enough, the physician in his consulting room writing his notes, the courtroom of the parliamentary inquiry, the table at which the Berne Convention was signed, the last factory that changed its chemistry and closed its white phosphorus dipping room forever. Let that history settle in you now like the last of the evening's warmth. The factory is quiet. The rooms are still. The work of tomorrow is a cleaner work than the work of yesterday, and the people who do it go home without the phosphorus in their bones. The match glows for a moment and goes out. The candlelight takes its place. The room fills with a steady, warm, ordinary light. And the world, slowly, imperfectly, goes on becoming what it ought to have been from the beginning. There is a practice among certain historians of thinking about historical processes not in terms of their outcomes, but in terms of their pace, asking not just what changed, but how long the change took, and what the cost of that pace was. The history of phossy jaw invites that kind of thinking with particular force. The pace of the reform was not determined by the pace of the science. The science was essentially complete in the 1840s and remained correct, and was repeatedly confirmed over the following 60 years. There is a philosophical question here that the history of phossy jaw poses with unusual clarity, a question about the relationship between knowledge and responsibility. If a harm is known to be occurring, and if the means to prevent it are known to be available, at what point does the failure to prevent it become a moral failure rather than simply a practical shortcoming? The match manufacturers of the 1850s and 1860s and 1870s were not operating in ignorance of the harm their products caused to the workers who made them. Some had more specific knowledge than others. Some had access to the medical literature and had read it. Some had heard the reports of their own factory physicians or the observations of factory inspectors. Some had simply seen, with their own eyes, the workers in the dipping rooms developing the jaw condition over the years of their employment. None of this knowledge required a complex ethical analysis to yield the conclusion that the workers were being harmed by the chemistry of the production process, and that a different chemistry was available that would not harm them. The analysis required was simple. The conclusion it pointed toward was clear. The obstacle to acting on it was not moral uncertainty, but economic interest. The white phosphorus chemistry was cheaper, and the capital investment in the existing process was substantial, and the competitive position of any manufacturer who changed chemistry unilaterally was potentially disadvantaged relative to those who did not. The economic interest was real. It is not nothing. The manufacturers were operating in a genuinely competitive environment, and the choices available to them were constrained by that environment in ways that made unilateral action genuinely costly. But the workers were paying a higher cost than the manufacturers were refusing to pay. The workers were paying with their health, their function, and in some cases their lives. And the moral weight of this comparison, the comparison between the cost to manufacturers of changing their chemistry and the cost to workers of the manufacturer's decision not to change it, is not a difficult comparison to make. The pace of the reform was not determined by the pace of the science. The science was essentially complete in the 1840s and remained correct and was repeatedly confirmed over the following 60 years. The pace was determined by other things, by the political framework that gave manufacturers more power than workers in the negotiation over working conditions, by the financial interests that gave manufacturers strong reasons to resist the change, by the international competitive structure that made any individual country reluctant to act unilaterally, by the bureaucratic inertia of regulatory bodies that had limited authority and limited political support for using it aggressively. These were real constraints. They are not invented obstacles that a different version of history would have easily overcome. They were structural features of the industrial society of the 19th century, features that the Victorian era was in some respects only beginning to understand and address. The factory legislation of the 1830s and 1840s had been a genuine achievement, and the social reformers of the period who had produced it had worked hard against significant resistance. The extension of that framework to cover chemical hazards was a further step that took further time and further effort. But the constraints were not absolute. Denmark found a path through them in 1874. The path Denmark found was available to England and France and Germany and the United States in 1874. They did not take it. The reasons they did not take it were the same reasons that had prevented action for the previous 30 years. The competitive argument, the freedom of contract doctrine, the bureaucratic inertia, the manufacturer's resistance. Denmark's prohibition had not resolved any of these obstacles for the larger countries. It had merely added a piece of evidence that they could and did set aside by noting that Denmark's smaller and less economically significant match industry made the comparison imperfect. The imperfection of the comparison was real, but it was not as great as the opponents of prohibition claimed. The Danish match industry, though smaller in absolute terms than the English or French industries, was proportionally significant to the Danish economy, and the transition had been managed without the economic disruption that the larger countries' manufacturers predicted for themselves. The evidence of the Danish case was evidence for the viability of prohibition, not merely in a small country with a small industry, but for any country willing to make the transition with adequate preparation and with the support of international agreements that prevented the competitive disadvantage the manufacturers were most afraid of. The path Denmark found was available to England and France and Germany and the United States in 1874. They did not take it. The workers who developed phossy jaw between 1874 and 1910 developed it in countries that had the Danish example in front of them and chose not to follow it. This is the specific grief that sits at the centre of the phossy jaw story, the grief not just for the harm that happened, but for the harm that happened after the demonstration that it did not have to happen, after Denmark, after every subsequent year in which the Danish evidence was cited and the English or French or American legislature or regulatory body declined to act on it. The grief is real. It should be acknowledged and not smoothed away. And then, having acknowledged it, you can also hold the other thing, the thing that is also real. The reform came. The work of the physicians and the reformers and the workers was not wasted. The harm stopped. The dipping rooms were cleaned. The next generation of matchworkers went home from work without the phosphorus in their bones. Let the night hold both of these things, the grief and the completion, the failure of pace and the fact of ending. Let them sit beside each other without either erasing the other. This is what the historical record asks of us, to look at what happened with clear eyes, to acknowledge the failure and the achievement in the same act of attention, to understand that a reform that took too long is still a reform, and that the people who brought it about despite the length of the journey deserve to be remembered. The matchbox on the shelf, the small ordinary object, the chemistry inside it chosen rather than inherited, chosen after a fight that lasted 80 years and was finally won. The women of the dipping rooms are all gone now in the physical sense, as everyone who lived and worked in the 19th century is gone. But they are in the archives. Their names are in the hospital records and the factory inspection files and the parliamentary testimony. Their cases are in the medical literature. Their action is in the history of the labour movement. They are present in the form that the past is always present, as a record that can be read and a story that can be told and a weight of evidence about what was done and what could have been done differently. We tell this story tonight not as a lesson, or not only as a lesson. We tell it because it is true, because the true things about human life in all its difficulty and persistence are worth knowing, because the specific gravity of a real history is different from the gravity of any invented one. These women lived, these factories existed, this chemistry was used and its harm documented, and the documentation filed and set aside and eventually, through the work of many people over many years, acted on. The ending is real, that matters. History rarely offers endings that are clean. Most of the injustices and harms that historians document did not end exactly. They transformed, or diminished, or were addressed in one form and reappeared in another. The full abolition of a harm, the specific moment at which a wrong that was being done was stopped, and not subsequently replaced by an equivalent wrong, is rarer in the historical record than reformers would like, and rarer than the optimism of reform movements sometimes assumes. Phossy jaw ended, not transformed, not reduced, ended. The workers who entered the match factories after Prohibition did not develop the disease. The specific harm that had been documented and allowed to continue for 8 decades was prevented. The prevention was permanent. The ending was real. That matters because it is evidence that permanent endings are possible, that the accumulation of evidence and advocacy and organisation and political pressure, extended over long enough and with sufficient tenacity, can produce outcomes that are not merely improvements on the existing situation, but genuine closures of a specific harm. This is not always achievable. It is not always achieved even when it should be. But it has been achieved, in this case, in the specific and documented case of the white phosphorus match. The ending is real, that matters. The matchbox on the shelf, the small ordinary object, the chemistry inside it chosen rather than inherited, chosen after a fight that lasted 80 years and was finally won. Let that be enough for tonight. Let the images come now in no particular order, in the way that the mind arranges things as it moves towards sleep, not in chronological sequence but in the sequence of significance, the images that have weight settling to the centre while the others drift at the periphery. Brand in his Hamburg laboratory, looking at the cold fire he's made from something as ordinary as urine. Surprised? Unsettled. Not yet knowing what he has found. Walker in Stockton-on-Tees, drawing a coated splint across a rough surface and watching it light. Pleased. Practical. Already thinking about who might want to buy these. Soria at the École Polytechnique, refining the formula, achieving the reliable ignition that makes the phosphorus match a commercial proposition. Proud of the technical elegance, not yet thinking about the factories where it will be made. Lorenzer in Vienna, examining a matchworker's jaw, writing his case notes in the careful clinical Latin of the period, reaching the conclusion that will be ignored for 60 years, doing his job, unable to do more than his job allows. The women at the gate of Bryant May on the morning of the 5th of July, 1888. The foreman expecting them to file in as usual. The gate not moving. 1,400 women who have decided together not to go in. The room where the Berne Convention was signed. The pens moving across paper. The delegates not thinking, perhaps, about the women in the East End or the men in the Viennese factories or the children in the Leyen works. Thinking about trade policy and commercial competition and the language of treaties, but signing. The last dipping room in England to change its chemistry. The white phosphorus paste replaced with something safer. The room cleaned. The workers arriving to find a different substance in the trays, not knowing perhaps what had been there before or what the change meant in the longer arc of things, just knowing the work. The archive where Sarah's name is preserved. The cardboard box of records. The faded ink. Her name, her age, her address. The notation of her presenting complaint and her history of factory employment, recorded in the shorthand of a busy hospital physician in the East End of London in a year when the city was vast and the poor were numerous and the hospital was always full. Her name, still there, still readable, still, in the way that names in archives are, a kind of presence. Let it rest there. Let the night cover it gently, the way the night covers everything, without preference, without judgment, without the impatience of the day. You have been listening well. The story is complete. The night is long and the room is quiet and everything that needs to be said has been said. Before you rest, let one more image settle. Think about what a match is, in the deepest sense of the thing. It is an object designed to do one thing, to produce fire on demand. That is its entire purpose. It has no other function. It does not store fire or display it or measure it. It makes it once and is consumed in the making. The match exists at the intersection of human ingenuity and human need. The need for fire is as old as humanity, older than agriculture, older than writing, older than cities. It is one of the primary needs, one of the things without which the human project as we know it cannot proceed. Warmth, light, the transformation of raw food into nourishing food, the forging of metals, the firing of clay, all of it built on the controlled use of fire, all of it dependent on the ability to make fire when fire is needed. For most of human history, making fire required patience, skill, and the right materials in the right conditions. The match removed those requirements. It made fire instantaneous and reliable and available to anyone regardless of skill or patience or conditions. This was a genuine gift to human life. It is still a gift. Every time someone lights a candle or starts a stove or touches a flame to a birthday cake, and the whole room brightens for a moment. The history of phossy jaw does not take away that gift. It adds to it the knowledge of what the gift cost, who paid for it, and how long it took before the cost was reduced to something that could be absorbed without destroying the people who absorbed it. The gift and the cost are both real. The matchbox contains both of them. When you strike a match now, or use a lighter that contains the same evolved technology, you are the beneficiary of 200 years of the human effort to make reliable fire available and safe. The availability came first. The safety came later, after a long fight. Both are present in the small flame that appears at the tip and lasts for 3 seconds before it goes out. Rest now. Let the night receive you. Let the small concerns of the day that have been waiting, patient and persistent, at the margins of your attention, let them drift back. They will be there in the morning. The morning will come. The morning will bring with it its ordinary necessities, which will be met with the ordinary resilience that you have, which is more than sufficient. But that is the morning, this is the night. And in the night there is only this: the quiet room, the slow breath, the dark that holds everything with equal gentleness. The day is done, the story is told, the matches on the shelf are clean and ordinary and ask nothing of you. Sleep now, you have been listening well. The night is full, the story is complete, and there is nothing more to hold. Let the history settle into its proper place, not forgotten, not lost, but filed gently in the part of you that knows things now, the part that carries them quietly forward into ordinary days. Rest now. Come back now, very gently, to this quiet moment. The story is complete, let it rest. Let the images settle slowly, like snow settling after it has fallen, covering everything it touches with a gentle, uniform quiet. The narrow street in the East End of London, the factory walls, dark brick against a grey sky, the dipping room lit by gas lamps, the pale trays of phosphorus paste, the hands of the women moving steadily through the hours of the working day, the faint glow on their faces in the dimming light, the physician's notes accumulating in the journals, the reformers' articles in the newspapers, the women at the factory gate in the summer of 1888, standing together in the morning sun, 1,400 of them, refusing to go back in until things changed. The treaty signed, the prohibition implemented, the dipping rooms cleaned out and restocked with safer chemistry, the absence of new cases spreading quietly through the medical record like a kind of silence. All of it real, all of it happened, all of it part of the history of a small object that sits on a kitchen shelf in an ordinary box and does its single task and is thrown away. Let your breathing slow now. Let your body rest fully into the surface beneath you. There is nothing to hold on to tonight. The story is told. The night is long and gentle, and you are safe inside it. The candle burns steady and low. The room is warm. The city outside is still. Even the street sounds have faded to almost nothing. The world outside is dark and quiet and full of ordinary sleeping people. Far away in the dark, a match is struck, a small flame, a moment of ordinary light, and then quiet again. Sleep now, you've been listening well. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. What part of the white phosphorus match story struck you most? The women who struck for better conditions, the decades-long fight to change the law, or the strange and haunting image of workers glowing in the dark on their walk home? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.